For the next 2 hours, all you will have is a story.
A name taught to behave. A vow that learns to breathe.
4 notes, and the second holds. Continuity. So gentle it feels like anesthesia.
Apps that flinch under lamplight. Feast days that walk by inches.
Choose. Questions in chains become altars. History isn't what happened. It's what survived the edits.
Ropes only.
Late courage, without banners.
Don't stop asking questions.
Before we begin, lower the lights and let the city fall quiet. This is a fictional, documentary-style bedtime story, whispers from vaulted stone and pages that remember too much. If quiet mysteries help you drift, follow along and breathe with me. Stay curious, stay kind to your questions, and let the night carry us into the bloodlit labyrinth. I was ordained to keep silence, and for years I did, the way a stone keeps the memory of a builder's hand, without complaint, without voice, merely by being heavy and hard to move. Tonight I speak because the weight has become a kind of fever, and because silence, I finally understood, was never sacred. It was enforced. If you are listening, lower the light. Let the room thin to its edges. Somewhere above your ceiling, a clock is missing a second. I've come to return it. You may call me the defrocked archivist. I once had a baptismal name and a surname that tied me to a village of citrus trees and terracotta roofs. But names are also books, and books are easily rebound. I am safer as a subject heading without an author, a spine with no title. I served below the basilica, far under the marble transparency that pilgrims trusted with their prayers, below the bronze canopy that drinks sunlight like honey. I served in the ducts and corridors where the air has a temperature even in summer, where the walls smell of lamp oil and old wax, and parchment stained the color of dried blood, the color that becomes the memory of red after red is gone. It is not a metaphor to say the light bled. In those passages, when the doors sealed, the emergency lamps hummed and flooded everything with a low arterial glow. We called it the Bloodlit Labyrinth, not for a murder that happened there, but for the way your eye learned to prefer red to the absence beyond it. I did not descend the first time out of zeal. Zeal does not survive in archives. It dries into dust and gets brushed off the foredges during routine conservation. I descended because a ledger asked me to. The wrong hand had initialed the chain for a codex that should have remained on the 4th shelf, 3rd bay, in a modest room that pretended to be a dead end. A chain had been moved. Chains do not move by intention. They move like time moves in places where the hour is not the master of the bell, but its well-trained servant. I was sent to verify. Only verify, the sacristan had said, pushing the key across the desk as if it were not iron but ice. Do not read. Do not linger, he smiled, in the way men smile when a phrase has been issued to them, polished by use, and they enjoy the shine. The stair to the labyrinth is older than charity and younger than sin. It does not belong to a single century. Brick gives way to limestone, limestone to blocks veined like old marble meat, and then to ribs of Renaissance ambition, all of it turning and turning, landings that refuse to align with any rational geometry. On one wall I passed a fresco of constellations, patched and repatched, Ursa, Draco, Virgo, each star in its appointed pinprick, and then one extra star, a silent pilferer, placed just outside the comfort of myth. On another landing, a fresco of a sundial that shadows no hour men know. On the third landing, the temperature drops, and a plume of my breath lingers like an unconfessed name. The stairs remember feet you will never count. Philosophers who traded voices for access. Abbots with doubts hidden in the lids of their eyes. Soldiers who looked away from swords and looked harder at maps. The curious who learned that curiosity can be trained to heal but never wholly housebroken. At the bottleneck, where the stair narrows by one stone, the custodian waited. A custodian is a kind of priest who confesses to locks instead of to God. He knows which hinges complain and which hinges pretend. This one had a face like a Roman coin found by accident in a field worn, news from a time when the metal still believed it was earth. He did not give me his name. He did not ask for mine. Keys announced themselves on his ring by smell, not sound. If you have never smelled cold iron, the sentence will refuse you. He opened the first door, carved with a chalice, and the air inside it tasted of wine that remembered its grapes. He opened the second, carved with a clock whose hands pointed to noon and midnight at once, and the air inside it refused to move. He did not open the third. He stood beside it and tilted his head, as if listening to a vowel pronounced through the grain of wood. The third door was plain. The plain doors are the ones that matter. Verify the chain, he said. Do not read. The phrase wore his mouth like an old glove. If the seal has been touched, reseal with the eyelid stamp, he added, and showed me the wax that waited in a little tin with a glass lid. On the wax the mold was carved as a closed eye. You do not need Latin to understand such heraldry. A closed eye means what it has always meant. Someone else has promised to look for you. The room beyond did not immediately present as a room. It presented as a decision to avoid corners. The shelves did not meet the walls, and the walls did not promise to stay walls. The only straight thing was the spine of the chain that led from a ring in the floor to a ring in the codex's leather, and then up again to a ring in the ceiling. The chain was warm. Iron ran time the way veins run blood. I wrote my initials in the ledger, my fabulous name. The hour in a script that acknowledged the clock above ground, but did not serve it, the tiny note. Chain misregistered, and then I knelt to see the clasp. The seal was intact. The wax eyelid slept. I could have initialed the ledger, reseated the leather, and climbed into the safer air of the basilica, where saints glow with manageable radiance and tourists feel the exact size of their insignificance and are comforted by it. You would have been spared this confession. The weight would have remained my private fever. But an archivist does not work on the level of sealed and unsealed. We work at the level of why is a seal shaped like a sleeping eye if eyes are meant to watch. My thumb hovered. My heart performed its little chores. I can tell you now what I did, because it cannot be undone. I touched the wax. Sometimes wax breaks like a brittle thing. Sometimes it opens like a throat. This opened. The lid unblinded, so that for a wafer of a second I thought the eye in the wax had truly looked at me and grown wet. Then it was only wax again, cracked from pupil to lid, and the smell of it rose. Not bees, not honey. Parchment warmed by a fire that was no longer present. Parchment that had remembered flame in the way a body remembers a fever after the fever has left. I broke the seal, and the chain loosened, and the codex fell open to its middle, the way the bodies of certain martyrs fall open, in the biographies that prefer to describe entrails to the habit of forgetting. I tell you now that I did not read, I was read. A font is a city of habits for a letter to live in. The letters in that codex had been taught other habits in other cities, and they walked toward me. My language was Latin and Greek, in the manner of a clerk, patient with its defects, desiring to be understood more than to be loved. The book's language was Latin and Greek, in the manner of an illness that had agreed to inhabit a body if the body would agree not to die. My eye passed along the lines the way a finger passes over a scar it cannot recall receiving. The title filled the first page in rubric, De Mensura Memoria, on the measurement of memory. The second line, in a thinner hand, added, Phantomum tempus adducem populorum, phantom time for public use. The book was not a treatise. It was a ledger. The ledger's columns recorded years the way a miser records breath, excessively, with an arithmetic that trusts the tally more than the chest that rises and falls. In the leftmost column, months. In the second, feasts. In the third, a note that looks decorative until you follow its tiny hooks and realize it is instruction. If memory resists, rearrange feast days. If a people remembers a famine during what the calendar prescribes as a season of abundance, move the miracle. Move the saints. Teach the river to flow uphill. The dates were not wrong. They were obedient. They had learned to stand in formation and to march in place until the parade was declared a victory. Under the ledger lay the book I had been sent to verify, a chained codex in leather that did not trust the present temperature. The chain had been misregistered because someone had unhooked it and rehooked it in a hurry. I saw the hurry in the way the ring had bruised the leather. I saw other bruises too. An abrasion in the lower corner where a hand, anxious, had habitually gripped it, a trace of soot on the foredge that was not soot so much as the memory of a thumb that had been near a candle every time it was tempted to turn a page. I raised the cover. On the first folio, an illumination of a woman with a halo and no star above her crown, though the sky behind her was thick with points. The caption called her Maria non stellata, Mary the Unstarred, who maps the sky inside the skull. I have never found her again in any canon. If you own a list of saints, look, you will not find her. You will, if you are susceptible to the companionship of absence, feel as if a name just vacated the room. Beneath the Unstarred Gospel lay another book with a square of silver glass fixed to its cover, as if the first pleasure of reading were to confront your own reflection. The Thomas of Mirrors, its spine declared, and when I drew it back only a finger's width, my face blurred in the square. Not because the mirror was bad, but because the mirror remembered other faces and required that I prove my memory superior to theirs before it would reveal me cleanly. You cannot imagine how much negotiation the simple act of seeing one's own nose can require if the glass has become stubborn with witnesses. I had been told never to linger. Linger is an ugly verb in bureaucracies. It suggests that time is not an obedient pet, but a set of keys we all share, and it makes men with schedules remember their mortality. So, I moved my hand more than I moved my gaze, turning a page without reading it, turning another. A map slipped loose and fell, and I caught it by the edge, and the Atlantic was too narrow, and Africa leaned toward the west like a man about to whisper, and several islands crowded where I knew only one. The legend, in tiny red script, starred certain coasts and left others unlit. The starred coasts were labeled silent. Jesuit roots silent. Rosicrucian holds starred. Custodians unnamed. Not a war of armies, then. A war of maps. I wondered, not yet frightened but preoccupied. How many harbors a war of maps can swallow before a city forgets that it ever looked in another direction at dawn? The custodian's cough came from nowhere, like a suggestion to take shorter breaths. Verify, he said. And the word verified itself as a key rather than a request. His hands remained in his sleeves. Custodians keep their hands in their sleeves to remind you that their hands are not what opens and closes things. The doors answer to a narrower parliament. I am verifying, I said, and the word sounded like an apology to the chain, which I raised and felt, still warm. Warmth tells you nothing in some rooms. In others, it tells you that the metal knows what your pulse knows and prefers it to whatever has been written about time by men who love numbers more than mornings. When the codex fell closed again, I saw the eyelid stamp in its saucer of wax. A closed eye is not always asleep. Some eyes close to remember better. I turned the stamp upside down and watched the lid change to a curve like a smile, the way a child flips a frown into comedy with a fingertip. The custodian watched me, not watching him. In your own life, you will often know when you are being allowed to disobey, and when you are being prepared to be punished. I was being allowed. Is this a confession? You may ask me. Because we are near the gate, and I am speaking in a voice that likes the idea of gates and the idea of being let through them. It is a confession in the sense that the first thing a door hears when it meets you is an intention. My intention was not curiosity, though I accept that curiosity carried the flame. My intention was to measure the size of the room my obedience had built around me. If obedience is a wall, someone must count the stones. I was tired of being a stone. I left the ledger open and crossed to a smaller table under a vent that exhaled as rhythmically as a sleeping giant. There, the air tasted of tin and old tears. A glass case held a quill with a nib as thin as the regret that follows an accurate insult. Another case held a compass that did not point but spun. It spun when a lie was told. I tested it with a small one about the weather, and it hesitated. You may not think the sky is capable of deceit, but the sky's calendar was, and the instrument had grown sardonic in its old age. An astrolabe leaned against a velvet cushion. The chart, wired to its dial, predicted an eclipse I knew had happened 2 summers ago but placed it 3 days earlier. Move the miracle, move the shadow, move the grief. Teach the eye to agree or to suffer. I will not pretend now that this was the first time I suspected a second archive below the secret one, a ledger beneath the ledger. Men who live close to books develop a kind of tinnitus for erased things. You hear a sound that is not there, and trust enough of it to look for the bell. You ask a date to say itself out loud, and you hear a cough in the middle of the word. You catch yourself remembering a saint's day, and find the name you spoke belongs to no calendar, though the prayer feels practiced. Even as a novice, I had sensed a seam in the stone, somewhere under the treasury, a seam that disliked being looked at directly. It was like noticing the extra star painted in the dizzy margin of a ceiling, unimportant if you do not know where you are, inarguable if you do. The custodian said nothing. Silence, Down there was not an absence, but a staff position with a small office and a limited budget. I turned back to the chained book, reseated its ring, pressed the wax with the eyelid, and closed the lid until the eye returned to sleep. I wrote a tidy note in the ledger, chain verified, folios intact, marginal soot noted, map misfiled. I could have signed and left. I tell you again, I could have left. There was even a moment when the air changed in that way. Air changes to announce a safer path, a lift in the pressure, as if the room exhaled with relief that I had not asked the impolite question. Then a draft licked the edge of another volume, and it opened a finger's width, and the page inside shone like fish scale, and in the gutter, where spine meets paper, a tiny script had been tattooed that was not the book's own hand, not the scribe's, but later someone else's confession, etched with a needle, magnified only when the bloodlit lamps shivered. It read, "If memory returns, expect rebellion without banners." That is the sentence that turned me from a clerk into this, not a rebellion of flags and drums and winter horses, but a rebellion that happens inside the furniture of a life, inside the sentence that sends you to market on Tuesday, inside the fold of a family story that always stops short of a dead man's middle name, inside the body that stands up in the dark because it remembers a staircase that no one in the house has ever built. Without banners, rebellion looks like insomnia and makes excellent neighbors. Without banners, it becomes hard to suppress. The custodian stepped closer, his feet testing the polite objections of each stone. "Do you confess anything?" he asked, at last. His voice came from behind his mouth. Men who live with locks learn to keep a second voice, in case the first is compromised. "I confess," I said, and the mirror across the room there is always a mirror, though sometimes the mirror is only a window that will not tell the truth about its obligations. Caught the shape of my head and made a small correction, as if to note the posture of a man who would dare to say a word that in this place usually belongs to the other side of a grate. I confessed that I had touched the wax with intention. I confessed that I doubted the hour printed on the ledger, that I believed the minutes had taken a detour through an older city. I confessed that a particular saint's name sat in my mouth like a missing tooth, and that I pressed my tongue into the gap to make sure it still hurt. I confessed that I had once, at 14, whispered to a star that was not on the official map, and that the star had moved closer. He listened the way a staircase listens when it decides whether to continue to carry you. When I finished, he did something disobedient. He removed his hands from his sleeves. In his palm lay a small ring of iron, no bigger than the wedding band a widower continues to wear. "Every chain," he said, "requires a missing part to open." He closed my fingers around the ring. Iron remembers the temperature of a hand more faithfully than a heart, remembers the temperature of a promise. The ring warmed. He said nothing else. He left by the plain door, and the room lost some of its shape, as if its favorite witness had gone and the air did not know how to sit anymore. I cannot tell you, not yet, what the ring fit or how it learned the discipline of certain locks. I can tell you that, as I climbed the first turns of the stair, I felt the basilica above me in all its official weight. Marble is a religion when it is arranged into majesty. Stone is a prayer when it insists on being carried across centuries by men who have fewer teeth than promises and more promises than sleep. I climbed, and the frescoes argued with one another in silence, and the clock that shows noon and midnight at once ticked a little louder as if to scold me for preferring ambiguity to the pleasure of exactness. I touched the wall where the seam in the stone pretended not to be. The seam pretended harder. A draught rose and tasted of chalk and incense, and the kind of ink that was made from rust and vinegar, the ink of corrections. When the door to the basilica opened, light behaved like a doctrine eager for converts. It walked into the stairwell without asking permission. Tourists move the way water moves when it aspires to be a crowd. A guard smiled the way a saint smiles when a sculptor carves him twice, once for the faithful and once for the archive. Above the guard, the ceiling roared with its painted faith, a whole heaven after a long-budget meeting in the studio, all those bodies in their practiced ecstasy, the geometry of light made into a hymn. None of them looked down. I did not leave at once. I stood at the edge of the nave, where the stone still had the stairs' coolness inside it, and I listened to the nave sound like a shell. A woman cried quietly, which is the only volume the basilica permits, unless it has decided to thunder. A tour guide recovered a fact and deployed it like a salve. A child asked why there were so many keys carved on doors, and a man with a badge told him the answer the way you tell a child the moon is a lamp. I looked up, not to pray, but to estimate how much weight the painted heaven required to stay aloft. Faith is heavy. Paint is heavier. I felt the ring in my pocket, like a second pulse. When I closed my eyes, the bloodlit stare did not, as I had hoped, fade. It rose behind my lids with new corridors I had yet to walk. The ring thrummed slightly, as if a small machine inside it had woken. I opened my eyes, and it quieted. Above the bronze canopy, somewhere beyond the tourists and the light that had learned to be public, a chorus sang a note that reminded me of an automaton's throat. The note did not end. In certain rooms, notes are stored for later consumption. I walked outside into the afternoon, and the city had the practiced indifference of a cathedral-side street that has seen too much pageantry to be impressed by any given procession. Rome is generous with its memories, the way a queen is generous with handkerchiefs. If you wave them properly in pictures, you may keep them. The sky was blue in the way that makes a painter feel supervised. The pigeons did what pigeons do. The sun combed the square with light that had learned all the good manners. I felt, as I always do after the stare, that the day did not belong to a calendar so much as the ticker tape of a parade the city had thrown for time and then forgot to sweep up. I went to the shadow of a column and stood there until the hour reintroduced itself to my body. I do not expect you to believe me yet. Belief is not the correct transaction. Not yet. At the gate of a story like this one, what I ask you to do is simpler and more dangerous. Listen for any place inside your memory where a date makes a shape like a bruise. Consider the family holiday that changed places on the wall calendar for no reason anyone cared to explain and now exists in your mouth as a flavor rather than a fact. Consider the star you cannot find again. Consider the picture in a book that looks different every time you return to it, though you have not touched the page. Consider the corridor you have walked in dreams since childhood, which attaches to no house you have lived in, but knows the weight of your feet. These are not accidents. These are not sins. These are seams. I will ask you, as a courtesy to the life you will continue to lead after my voice has faded, to disbelieve any sentence that insists time is a hallway with only one door. That way lies sleep without dreams. If you must sleep without dreams, sleep under a roof that has never kept a secret, Such roofs exist in barns and in houses built by men who were too poor to lie to gravity. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed under a ceiling that had been plastered in a hurry by men who talked about soccer while their hands invented a surface. The ring warmed and cooled against my thigh in a rhythm that almost remembered the sea. I counted backwards from the day's end into the day's beginning, and found several minutes that no longer had parents. I breathed as I had been trained to breathe in choir. Long, careful, capable of making a vowel last longer than a doubt. Every time I closed my eyes, the stare returned. Every time I opened them, the ceiling obliged by being less reliable. You see, a confession is not an apology. A confession is a map drawn by someone who has remembered a path and decided that forgetting it would be a greater sin than walking it again. I confess to the stare. I confess to the ledger. I confess to the extra star. I confess to the ring. I confess to the crown I have not yet described to you, and to the light that is not light that it drinks. I confess to the habit of touching my pocket to prove an object still exists, and I confess to the knowledge that even if I do not touch it, the object will exist because it has joined the choir of things that refuse to forget themselves. I confess to breaking the seal in the wax, and to reading the book that read me. And I confess, especially, to this. I am not afraid of the rebellion without banners. I am afraid of the day when the banners return and everyone agrees on their color. If you want me to be frightened for you, because stories like this ask for a priest who takes on the danger so that the congregation may relax, know that I am. I am frightened of how gentle the edits always are, how they ask nothing unreasonable. Move the feast 3 days to spare the fishermen a storm. Rename a city to dignify a martyr. Forget a saint whose miracles make certain bishops nervous. Let the map breathe a little differently, to let a dangerous coast forget its name. We will leave the monuments in place. We will only change the dates on the stones. We will leave the song. We will only move the key. We will leave the child her star. We will only convince her to call it something else and to stop watching it every night. The gentleness is the enforcement. This is what I learned first at the gate. The past is edited with a kindness that makes gratitude feel like complicity. I have said enough to cross the threshold. If you have followed me here, listen. A key has begun to turn. The room beyond this chapter will smell of iron and honey and a little like rain that fell on stone and decided to remember itself indoors. Do not hurry. Doors matter more when you feel their weight. I will not force your hand. I will only tell you that some doors open by themselves when the room decides you have become interesting enough to deserve a corridor. And the door I am telling you about now, the plain door, the one that prefers not to be looked at, has already begun to swing inward on its history of oiled hinges. If you are ready, breathe. The night will learn your name and keep it safe for an hour. The clock above you will forgive the missing second. And we will enter the bloodlit labyrinth together, where the chains hold more than books and the wax never truly sleeps. And where, if you are willing to touch iron with a hand that refuses to be obedient, the crown of black light will notice you noticing it, and something you were taught to forget will stir, stretch, and stand. I return to the stair, the way a fever returns to the body that learned to mistake it for warmth. I did not announce myself to anyone with a badge or a ring. Night was already halfway through its monologue with the city. The lanterns outside rehearsed their small halos. The square had become a choreography of shoes learning to be quiet. I carried the iron ring the custodian had pressed into my hand. In my pocket, it felt like a second pulse, sometimes in step with mine, sometimes 2 beats late, as if it preferred another century's rhythm. I did not tell myself I was brave. Bravery is what we call the idiom we use to speak to doors. The basilica, after hours, is not empty. It is full of what happens when people leave. The incense, relieved of ambition, becomes an honest smell. The gold stops performing majesty and remembers being metal. The marble cools into the exact shape of the quarry it came from. I crossed the nave and nodded to saints who do not blink, but who have learned to imitate the pre-blink attention of a guard dog. Beneath the canopy of bronze, above the graven keys that promise and unpromise, a choir of tourists' whispers went on, echoing themselves long after the tourists had gone, like a seashell made of speeches. The plain door to the stair recognized the iron ring, the way a pupil recognizes sudden brightness. The keyhole did not prefer being called a mouth, but tonight it behaved like one. It kissed the iron, tasted it, decided it was a memory permitted to return. The lock did not click. It sighed, and the door yielded by degrees, as if reluctant to admit what it had been built to admit. I stepped in, and the basilica's light, proud and public, stopped at the threshold like a dignitary who knows which rooms are for ceremony and which rooms are for work. The stair began. It is not a spiral so much as a series of iterative decisions. Corner, measured landing, a catechism in stone, with each question asked in a different dialect of the same faith. Brick gives way to limestone, and limestone to a bruised marble, then to a rib that could belong to a whale or to a vaulted chapel drawn at midnight by a student who has learned to love shadows more than lines. The steps are shallow enough to carry weight, steep enough to cause regret if you descend too quickly. On the second landing, a fresco of constellations waits, patient and accurate, and then you notice the additional star nested in a margin, a little arrogant in its refusal to be catalogued. On the third landing, the sundial painted on the wall throws a shadow where no light falls. When I inhaled, the air tasted of lamp oil, bees that forgot themselves into wax, and parchment with a memory of heat, the way a letter remembers being close to a candle and decides not to confess it. In that stair, your footfall returns to you in a language you do not speak. Steps echo wrong, coming back a fraction early or late. At one turn I heard an extra step I had not taken, and at the next turn I heard mine fail to return, as if a silence ahead had done the arithmetic and excluded me. It is a stair, built by architects with fevers and maintained by custodians, whose hands learned the posture of prayer by practicing with hinges. I passed the first door, the chalice carved in relief, its cup round as a remembered face, and the second with the clock, whose hands insist on pointing to noon and midnight at once, like the verdict of a jury that refuses to be sequestered. The plain third door, the door that matters by pretending not to, waited with the calm of furniture. The iron ring tensed in my palm. I set it into a notch that was not a notch until the ring revealed it. The door unlocked, not with a click, but with something like the discipline of an old choir, a subtle alignment of small intentions. I will say this plainly so that anyone inclined to dismiss metaphors can continue. The corridors below do not obey a single century. They juxtapose periods not the way a museum arranges rooms, with labels and politeness, but the way geology arranges strata after an earthquake, edges pressed into other edges, histories that do not love one another, forced into intimacy. A Roman arch begins and ends in a Renaissance pier. A medieval rib vault bends into a Baroque corridor, then forgets to finish, leaving stone that flickers between plan and poem. The air cools in pulses. Once, a draft came up smelling of damp feathers, and I thought of vaults lined with the breath of an old choir, and then the smell was gone, replaced by an iodine thinness like the inside of a clock. The first chamber I entered contained lists. Not shelves of books, those I expected, but lists written on the long hides of animals in a hand as steady as sleep. A narrow table stood under a lamp whose light preferred red, columns labeled with saints' names, feast days, miracles recognized, and miracles pending reconsideration. In the margin, a notation in smaller script, "When a memory resists, change the day." People remember weather better than dates. If a field floods on the old Street Raymond's day, move Street Raymond. Praise the river later. I ran my finger along a row where a saint had been renamed for better calendars. The parchment warmed obediently under my touch. A living animal's second-to-last heartbeat stored in a line. Beyond that, an alcove of maps. At first I thought them corrupt copies. Africa pitched forward, the Atlantic narrowed, so that Europe seemed to reach for the West with the hunger of a debtor. Islands proliferated like leprosy in the waters, where public maps acknowledged only one. I found the same legend I'd caught before with the corner of my eye, a beadwork of small red stars indicating routes and holds. Jesuits, silent. Rosicrucians, starred. Custodians, unnamed. The silence was not accusation, it was policy. A single annotation, scratched in with a lamplighter's impatience. The sea is obedient if the map is confident. I rolled the map. It exhaled as if relieved. I had expected, because expectations are the only luggage we are allowed to carry openly in forbidden places to meet a superstition I could name and therefore master. But superstition is the honest relative of policy. Superstition says, don't walk under the ladder. Policy says, place the ladder where no one you dislike will get past it. Here the superstition was this: if you name a star that the calendar refuses, it will follow you down a stair. I felt that star at the edge of my sight, the way one feels a missing button with the thumb, a small absence that undresses the whole coat. A corridor shaped like a throat led to a room shaped like a lung. The floor was lined with tiles that whispered numbers when you stepped, Roman numerals drawn into the glaze, as if to remind the feet of arithmetic's claims. In the center stood a lectern with an open ledger labeled De Mentura Memoria, the measurement of memory. The same rubric as in the chained codex, but now writ large, as if the earlier book had been a pocket instruction, and this the manual for the machine. Columns again, months, feasts, eclipses, coronations, births that mattered to maps. A pen waited in a well of ink, the color of dried cherries. On the nib, salt crystals. Somewhere tears had been boiled into ink. I did not touch the pen. I did not trust my hands to keep their own counsel. In that ledger, the past was not rewritten, it was resequenced. The word for such work in the mouths of certain scholars is reform. Reform is a good word inside a church. It tastes of dust and courage. Here, reform was something else. An agreement among careful men to keep things smooth by rearranging the bumps beneath the carpet. A notation read, if the moon resists the scheduled feast, move the feast, and teach the moon to be ashamed of herself. Longer note, justified to the right margin. If a people arrive too soon at a discovery, offer them an older story. Stories are the softest prisons. I breathed. The room breathed back. A mechanical inhalation through a ceiling grill. Exhalation in a different register. A not music tuned to lungs. Somewhere beyond, a sound like small clocks practicing obedience. I followed. The corridor narrowed until the stone pressed my shoulders like an usher with strong opinions. The lamps along this passage were darker, their red leaning into brown. The dust rose reluctantly, as if jealous of the air. I came to a door with no carving on it, not chalice, not clock. The iron ring in my pocket turned by itself a fraction, as if the ring's memory had remembered a lock before I did. Inside, another library, not of books, but of decisions about books. Volumes chained shut with seals in the shape of eyelids, as if each book had been granted the dignity of sleeping through its own custody. On a low table, a pile of bindings removed from other books and stored like snakeskins, titles that would not be missed because their contents had been harvested into safer volumes. I picked up a sloughed spine, a title I had not seen since childhood, a history that had taught me to mistrust maps with their bare faith in coastlines. The leather was warm. The room recorded my thumbprint in its dust and then smoothed it away, as if unwilling to admit I had been there at all. In a corner, an object that misbehaved politely, a compass that spun only when a lie was told in its hearing. I said a small lie. I said my baptismal name, and the compass hesitated, then turned, then stopped, as if to warn me that the lie I believed least about myself still counted. I asked the object, nothing else. Instruments that judge have long memories and short patience. If you are not careful, they will teach you to prefer your secrets to their sentences. A whisper moved past the door. A draft that learned language briefly for the purpose of suggesting that I was expected elsewhere. I followed. Expectation is a tether, and down there we were all tethered to something we pretended to be tethering. The corridor bent twice too many times for the distance it covered and brought me before a small chapel with no name on the lintel. A mirror hung where an altar might have been. It was not ornate, not ornamented. The frame had been scratched with 1,000 tiny marks like a field after geese. I stepped close, and my face resisted me. It is an unsettling sensation to be refused by your own features, as if your skin had defaulted to an earlier owner. The surface fogged, then cleared. Around the edges, inscriptions too small to read unless you pressed your breath to the glass. I did. In the scratched ring at the perimeter, sentences, confess, and the mirror will remember for you. Do not confess, and the mirror will confess your silence. Some scratches were dates, some were constellations. One was a single word, choose. I did not speak there. The mirror had the energy of a listener pretending neutrality. I have learned to distrust such postures. You can tell when an object is waiting to be filled with your courage and then kept as inventory. The chapel's stone smelled of old rain and of oils that have nothing to do with sacraments. As I turned to leave, I saw my face become someone else's face. Not a stranger, exactly, but a familiarity from a dream I had never finished. I did not flinch. If you flinch in front of a mirror long enough, the mirror learns to flinch first. I have flinched enough in this life. I let the glass keep its superiority. Past the mirror, the passage opened on a balcony that overlooked a chamber shaped like a heart, not the muscular organ of a textbook, but the emblem on a pilgrim's ribbon, rounded, pointed, vulnerable by design. Below, bronze figures stood in ranks, mouths open, not statues of saints, but machines, a choir constructed of throats and bellows. I would come to know them later, to count their notes and the shutters they opened when they sang, to understand how the room used their song to stretch seconds and fold them. But tonight I only watched and listened and did not yet declare a name. Their mouths were closed. The silence was alert. A weight, a note that had not begun pressed against the ear from the inside as if demanding to be born. I left before they summoned me to their curriculum. Past the balcony, stone became, clay became plaster, became a corner that had forgotten what it had been asked to become. I found a workroom that might once have served a scribe. The implements were ready. A quill trimmed so sharply it insulted the air. A pair of spectacles ground to focus on distances that do not exist above ground. The space between letter and intention, between edit and memory. In a drawer, seals shaped like the eyelids closing, their handles worn by the thumbs of men who believed that sleep is a safe format for truth. Under the drawer paper, a note written in a small hand, unsigned. Silence is not sacred, it is scheduled. Another hand, below, in pencil. Schedules are sacred to those who survive by them. A date with 2 versions. One public, one nocti had been appended. I folded the note and left it where I found it. A future hand will need to find it again to believe me. Here and there the labyrinth declared itself with directness. A corridor narrowed, a door yielded, a lock told the ring in my pocket, an old joke. More often, the place behaved like a story told by someone who keeps stepping away from their subject at the moment of truth, not because they wish to deceive you, but because the truth cannot be told while looking at it directly. We live in a climate of overlight. Secrets require a weather different from the squares. In that weather, things grow in directions geometry does not approve. I walked for an hour, or for 10 minutes, or for the time it takes for breath to forget what year it is. The only reliable measure I had was the fatigue in my legs, which suggested the stair had remained behind me and became my shadow. When I found the chained book again, the one with the lid that sleeps, it was in a different room than before, though the notation in its ledger insisted I had returned to the same inventory. I opened it to the middle, where it prefers to fall. A page had been slipped into the gutter with care, not parchment, a thin sheet of hammered copper, etched with letters that do not belong to any alphabet I was taught, and yet which my mouth, in that room, understood. The copper sang as I traced it with a nail. The song had only 4 notes. They spelled a word that was not a word, but a function. Hold. The page behind the copper displayed the ledger of days during the Great Reform, when Julian time consented to Gregorian time and public years were plucked like weeds to tidy the garden. A marginal note in a patient hand. If you remove days, give the people something to mourn, so that their grief exhausts itself before it notices what is truly gone. Below, a list of funerals and fireworks, pageants and saintly processions scheduled to keep a sorrow busy. That is the nature of the stair. It does not only descend through stone, it descends through the ways we are taught to metabolize loss. I resealed the codex with the eyelid, pressing the seal until the wax softened enough to accept its old sleep. My fingers tasted of metal and resin. When I lifted them to my lips, the iron in my mouth remembered my childhood's small cuts and the way we learned to call them brave. The lamps throbbed once. The walls relaxed. The minimum amount stone is permitted. Somewhere behind, a shutter opened and a shutter closed, and the pulse of the chamber adjusted by a half-breath to the room's decision about time. At the end of the corridor I found a door framed by 6 iron ribs that rose like trees without leaves. A draught flowed from beneath, cooler than the rest, and carried with it a scent I have been haunted by since. Not blood, but something that quotes the memory of blood after it has had the dignity of leaving the body. Copper softened into a metallic dusk. On the threshold, scratched into the stone in a fast, careful script, "If you look, remember. If you remember, tell. If you tell, tell gently, because people sleep here." I touched the inscription and felt the stone warm a fraction, as if a hand on the other side had pressed to meet mine. The iron ring turned against my palm of its own accord, not fully, only enough to remind me that locks are agreements between ignorance and desire. I did not enter. Not yet. The long stair is not a path you master by insisting. It tells you how to walk it if you have the patience to let your feet be taught their arithmetic. I turned back toward the way I had come, marking with my eye the irregularities that would serve as my coordinates should the corridors decide to rearrange themselves, and they often do, with the courtesy of a host reorganizing furniture to better observe a guest. A crack in the floor tile shaped like a thorn, a patch of plaster the color of old bread, a lamp that favored one corner and left the rest sullen. I counted my steps without believing the count and found my way to the stair proper, where the frescoes resumed their argument with geometry. At the second landing, the stars on the ceiling seemed closer, and the extra star, the unsanctioned one, had drifted by a finger's width toward the picture's edge, the way a bead of water migrates along a window until it decides to drop. The sundial's shadow had inched a degree, though no light fed it. On the first door, the chalice looked deeper, as if someone had poured the floor into it. The clock on the second door persisted in its obsession with noon and midnight. A hairline crack had appeared through the 12, like a spiderweb spun by an arachnid with ecclesiastical ambitions. I touched the crack. It was warmer than the surrounding wood. I leaned my head until my ear rested on the panel. From inside the door came the softest murmur, like a murmured vow said by a congregation too tired to persist or too careful to be heard. I stepped back. The iron ring quieted. The stair regarded me with the impersonal affection of a tool. Above, the basilica's public light waited. I did not rush to it. Between one landing and the next, the air thinned into something finer than oxygen, the way mountain air turns honest about how little of it your body truly needs. I paused and closed my eyes and felt, for the first time without panic, what the stair intended to teach: that a descent can also be an ascent if measured in the right units. That time can be held long enough to be stitched and released without leaving a scar that anyone will agree to see. That memory, when bruised, blooms late. I stood and let the bloom form. It smelled like paper, warmed by breath. When I emerged, the nave behaved beautifully, as if it had been told company was coming. The lamps rehearsed their loyalties. A guard yawned in a tone that honored both his fatigue and the building's preference for decorum. I returned the iron ring to my pocket. It cooled, then warmed, then settled into the temperature of a promise. I crossed to the door that faces the square and let the night meet me with its old bored kindness. The city did not ask me what I had seen. Cities that live with cathedrals have learned not to ask. They prefer to be told stories in which they feature as setting, not as accomplice. At home, if a postulant's bed in a room that once served as an accounts office can be called home, I lay down without undressing. The ceiling, which had been patched often and poorly, looked like a map of a country where poverties share borders. From the hallway, a plumbing noise did the work of a distant sea. The iron ring on the nightstand exhaled once, a sound too small to be called a sound. I thought of the ledger of missing hours, of the constellations with an extra star, of the maps with their courteous lies, of the mirror that confesses your silence if you refuse to confess. I thought of the door framed by iron trees, and the scent that alluded to blood, the way a quotation alludes to the book that holds it. And I thought of how gently the stair had carried me down, and how easily it might carry me further. Sleep came like a cautious archivist to a difficult collection, gloved, impatient, resigned to the work. In that sleep I walked the stair again, this time in daylight that had been persuaded to behave like darkness. My steps did not echo. The lamps were unlit, and nevertheless gave off the scolding of elder ants. At the third landing, where the sundial lies to itself, a child sat with his feet through the rails, counting in a language I knew only as a hymn. He looked up without eyes. He said, "When you return, bring the hours you dropped." He meant the rebellion without banners. He meant the seconds the choir will freeze. He meant the names taught to step off calendars politely. I woke before the bell, that metal mouth trained by centuries to behave like a heart. Dawn had arrived with its ordinary theater, hoping to make us all believe in the sequence of colors again. I gave the ring a half-turn on the table, the way one might turn the page of a book while considering whether it is wise to continue. The ring turned itself back the other way, a courteous contradiction. There is dignity in being told no by an object that remembers more than you do. I smiled. A small admission that some doors should be allowed to teach you how to knock. I will go down again. I must. The stair knows my weight now, and the doors have memorized the shape of the ring's breadth. But the rule of the long stair is this: you do not descend twice for the same reason. The first time is curiosity, dressed as verification. The second time is hunger, dressed as duty. When I go, I will carry bread in my pocket, and a name on my tongue that has been gone from the calendar so long that even its vowels have grown dust. I will return to the room where decisions about books sleep in their eyelids. I will listen at the mirror until it forgives me for not telling it a secret. I will enter the chamber framed by iron trees, and I will see, finally and without metaphor, the crown that drinks light not to extinguish it, but to reveal what light cannot illuminate without assistance: the edits, the seams, the gentle prisons. And I will tell you what it says in the alphabet of my first prayer. For now, know this, because you cannot yet smell the iron or feel the floor's small refusal. A stair is not a journey, it is a contract, between descent and memory, between the door and the hand, between what must be kept and what, if kept, becomes a weapon. We have all signed it without reading. My signature is not the first. It will not be the last. The Bloodlit Labyrinth has enough ink for every name. It will take yours gently if you offer it, and more gently still if you refuse. Thinking. I did not open the ledger to learn anything. I opened it because breath collects in the lungs of a room until someone turns a page. The book lay on its lectern like a patient who had been taught to pretend sleep when the doctor entered. A strap of cracked leather crossed the cover. The buckle had been polished by hands that swore they did not polish. When I unfastened it, the smell rose the paper's idea of rain, the iron breath of old ink, a sweetness that might once have been honey, and now only performed honey's ghost. The lamps along the walls reddened to oblige the eyes. The margin of the night pressed its ear to the door. I turned the first page, and the ledger remembered me as if I were a minor saint come back to check whether my day had survived the latest revision. De mensura memoria, it announced, rubric bright as an obedient wound, on the measurement of memory, not the keeping, not the guarding, not the sanctification. The measurement, the way a tailor measures a body to make the robe fit the hierarchy and not the person. Columns stretched across the folio like an army prepared to march through the centuries. Month, feast, eclipse, emendation, public notice, private note. A hand as calm as anesthesia numbered the years in a script that refused to be surprised by itself. The first year I recognized, the second I accepted, the third I knew and did not know, as if the ledger had smiled and trimmed away a day I had been using as a bookmark in the story of my own adolescence. I touched the first entry with the care one gives a bruise when one is not ready to admit its source. If memory resists, rearrange feast days. The sentence did not sit in the margin to be consulted. It infiltrated the columns as a habit. After a river rose on the old street Raymond's day and men with wet shoes swore that the saint had winked at the cloud, the ledger recommended advancing the feast by 3 days so that the miracle would be remembered dry. After a field burned on street, Agnes's vigil, and made the barley cunning and bitter, the ledger advised postponing the night and issuing a pastoral letter that taught the fire a better hour in which to be itself. A priest, who was also a mathematician, had calculated the elasticity of grief, the number of days between a death and the day the living consent to narrative. The figure in the margin was crossed out and rewritten twice. In a corner, a smaller hand added, "If a people refuses, give them a procession." Processions move memory along the street so that no house has to host it overnight. I turned a page. The air cooled, as if the room believed the next paragraphs should be read with less blood. Phantomum tempus ad usum populorum. Phantom time for public use. The heading wore its own sarcasm lightly, as if it pitied those of us who would only discover the joke after we had laughed at something else. The column of emendations thickened. Remove 10 days to reconcile a calendar to the stubborn moon. Remove 13 to satisfy a council that prefers round numbers. Remove a century to smooth an argument between emperors and bishops and the harvest. The ledger did not admit that the removals were removals. It preferred to say, "Reshelve hours from crowded months into the quiet stacks." The way we move books when a reading room becomes popular, discreet, courteous, a kindness that hides its theft inside its smile. I had heard it as rumor in the refectory when I was a student, a century that never occurred, a stair between floors nobody admits to climbing. In that rumor, the story went like this: a pope with a headache, an emperor with a pride, a scholar with a talent for subtraction, and a night when the bells refused to learn the new song but were taught anyway by men who loved hammers. The ledger's account was less dramatic and more damning. No hero, no villain, no crisis. A sequence of memos in which the tone remained unperturbed while the past was adjusted, with the steadiness of a surgeon altering a patient's face to match the photograph already hanging on the family wall. Public notice. Due to reforms, dates will be corrected to reflect astronomical realities. Please adjust your diaries accordingly. Private note. Schedule fireworks and a saint's canonization during the gap to busy the sorrow. Do not leave the populace alone with arithmetic. There were names crossed through with a line so thin it seemed to apologize. Saints without days, days without saints. Sancta Julia, chastened. Sanctus Petrus Minor, reclassified as legend. Marginalia explained, not unkindly, that certain biographies had encouraged people to expect miracles in quantities that the supply chain of wonder could not maintain. I spent an hour, 10 minutes, 3 breaths, tracing the deletion of a feast I had loved as a child. The night when our village sang itself awake, and we lit small fires in the orchard to convince Frost to forgive. The ledger advised moving the vigil forward a week so that the Frost would be unprepared to visit an ambush of warmth. We did. 10 years later, we forgot we had ever done otherwise. The orchard learned to choose its buds accordingly. The hymn found new vowels. This, too, the ledger had predicted. When the mouth adapts, the calendar is safe. I turned another page, and the paper thinned, not because it was cheaper stock, but because the script wished to move faster without appearing to hurry. Here were Gospels with night twins. The Gospel of Mary the Unstarred, whose parables use constellations that no longer belong to the sky. The Gospel of Thomas of Mirrors, whose beatitudes bless not the poor in spirit but the poor in memory, for they shall inherit a story that does not hurt. In the public notice column, silence. In the private note, copy 3 leaves into the Apocrypha drawer. Chain the remainder. If cited by scholars, refer to them as poets. In the far right margin, in a different hand. Poets remember what prose cannot admit without losing its job. A thin copper plate slid from the gutter and flashed its 4 notes under my fingertips. I had seen it earlier and named its function to myself. Hold. The reverse side bore a diagram like a clock, without numbers, shutters, hinges, a vent shaped like a throat. A note in a careful script labeled it Coram Horarum, the choir of hours. The machine I had glimpsed from the balcony, the bronze mouths, the bellows, the shutters in the ceiling that admit and refuse dust, lived as a drawing here, a preliminary confession of mechanism. When the choir sings all 4 notes, the shutters open together and the air stills. If the air stills long enough, the seconds hold. While the seconds hold, one may move the necessary piece, release, and the dust resumes. In another ink, faded almost out of existence, dust is what time writes when no one is reading. A cluster of entries in the emendations column wore a clerical patience. Correct Easter by decree. Compress a quarrel between cities into an oubliette of revise. Place the discovery after the blessing, so that the blessing appears to cause the discovery rather than the other way around. The ledger never said lie. It said sequence. It never said erase. It said rehouse. It never said punish. It said reduce access. Once, only once, a hand broke the style to write a word with vowels too wide for the column. Forget. The ink thinned immediately, as if someone had blotted it while it was still wet. A note below, in a third hand, asterisk. The correct term is curate. The ledger teaches itself to be innocent. I came to a page where the margins blackened, not burned, but inked in, as if the annotator had wished to build a wall around a text, and then remembered that walls are invitations to ladders. Within the dark frame, The entries changed tone. Papalis Doppelganger Registry. The heading had been erased and re-inked twice. Below, a list of popes the public remembers, and beside each, a penciled twin whose biography differed by a month. A city, a rumor. Not impostors the way pamphlets understand them. Not the carnival of forgeries, anti-popes, and evening dramas. These were administrative doubles dates advanced to give a council time to conclude, names held back to allow a scandal to become a rumor, and a rumor to become a confusion, and a confusion to become a silence. Beside each double, a prayer. The prayers were all the same prayer. They were short. They asked the listener to be kind to the version they would be required to keep. A thin ribbon red tired marked a section titled De Archivis Secretioribus, about the archives below the archives. When the chain grows warm, do not panic. If the eyelid opens, wait until it sleeps again. If a book confesses your silence, answer with a date. In the right margin, someone had drawn a tiny hand. Its finger pointed to a phrase whose Latinity behaved like a cent. Calendar as cage. The cage was meant kindly. Animals are kept safe in such places, and fed, and named. But animals in cages forget their own distances, and the ledger depended on that forgetting. If the span between two villages shrinks on the map, the old stories about the long road fall out of use. Once they have fallen out of use, they can be condemned as exaggerations. Once condemned, they can be converted into ornaments, folk tales to make children sleep, not instructions to make adults brave. The atlas followed, skin stretched smooth and taut, coastlines reduced to lines that had the nerve to call themselves truth. I lingered there longer than was wise. Maps are the easiest theology. Draw a line and teach it commandments. Here the commandments were practical and gentle and devastating. Rotate the coast. A storm will spare the harbor you cannot afford to rebuild. Invent an island. Sailors with appetites worse than their compasses will become lost en route to the truth. Widen the cape. The fleet you fear will require another season and arrive in a different war. In the legend the stars returned, neat and red, listing routes that preferred silence to testimony. Jesuits, silent. Rosicrucians, starred. Custodians, unnamed. Above the legend, an aphorism in a hand I could have loved if I had met it when it still belonged to its owner. A people will fight to defend a border they have walked. They will argue politely about a line they have only seen. That sentence was truer than any sermon I ever preached. I turned a few more leaves in the atlas and came to maps of the night sky, each with its extra star drawn in a corner as if the draftsman had allowed himself a small rudeness before returning to duty. The star wandered between plates as if it were walking the margins while the constellations rehearsed their official poses. On one folio, the star served as the dot over the I in a word an astronomer had not yet coined. On another, it took the place of a nail hole near the hinge. The star was an agreement with a childhood I had not yet remembered I had, and with a future I had already stolen by pronouncing that star's name to myself in secret. The ledger did not attempt to delete it. The ledger ignored it with professional excellence. That is how one loses a sky, through a bureaucracy's love of tidiness. I closed the atlas, and the bronze mouths of the choir of hours opened below the floor, a fraction, a throat clearing before song. I had not yet learned the 4 notes, not in my bones. I felt them as a pressure on the inside of the ear. T-I-M-E. Long vowels, generous consonants. the alphabet's gentle obedience enlisted to a harder purpose. A shutter slid somewhere, and a thin draft stroked the pages. The dust declined to rise. The second hand of my wristwatch rested, not frozen, but thinking. It would move again when the room lifted its hand. I knew then, without instruction, that if certain entries needed to be moved, this was the weather in which to move them, this the oxygen in which to trim a year and teach the lungs not to panic. I did not move anything. Do not credit me with virtue. Credit me with cowardice and the good taste to recognize that the book did not yet wish me to impersonate its habit. I read instead a set of directives addressed to men who had forgotten they were boys. If a discovery outpaces the blessing, publish the blessing as a rediscovery. If an artist paints the shadow that belongs to no object, correct the lamps and offer him a grant he cannot refuse. If a scientist demonstrates a proof that rearranges the parish's sleep, place the proof inside a reliquary and ask the faithful to kiss it. The lips will polish the edges, and no one will dare to call it a diagram. The mercy of these instructions horrifies me more now than any crude repression. They do not break the fingers that write. They guide the hand to a more respectable angle. There were sections for schools. Curricula of obedience disguised as curiosity, the best kind, the kind that made children clever within the fence. Teach the map before the meadow. Teach the calendar before the season. Teach the hymn before the wind. Take the children to the museum, where the old stones are grateful to be indoors. Tell them the stories in the plaques that have practiced not being startled by questions. In a narrower margin, a single admonition. Discourage stars over dormitories. They encourage memory to loosen its collar. On the opposite page, a ledger of scholarships granted to boys who asked inconvenient questions and learned to aim them at safer targets. Beneath the list, the brightest flames, redirected, warm the cathedral most efficiently. A section for saints dismissed with ceremony. Desanctification proceedings, it said, as if holiness were a job title that could be retired with a cake. Reasons are listed, vitae, encouraging stubbornness, miracles occurring on dates inconvenient for reforms, relics that breathe. The last reason was scratched and written again, relics that breathe. At the bottom of the page, a note I could not ignore. Reassign relics of reverse miracles to the breathing cabinet. Mark as instruments. Label as metaphors. I had seen the cabinet. I had not opened it. The astrolabe that predicts eclipses too accurately. The quill whose ink tastes of salt. The compass that spins when a lie is told. The ledger gave them chores and forbade them vocations. I had been turning pages for a time that had no sense of itself, when I reached a leaf where the ink had turned the color of old bruises. The heading, De Figmento Seculorum, on the fabrication of centuries. The text was sober. No drama, again. To reconcile the harvests to the throne and the moon to the choir, we propose the following measures. Then, a table. Holidays consolidated. Jubilees invented to justify processions that carry the populace over the gaps. Exemplary funerals promoted into calendars with tiers scheduled appropriately. The tone was managerial. It comforted itself with footnotes. In the corner, a hand less steady than the others had written, "We will be forgiven, because we will schedule the forgiveness and ring the bells with enough sincerity." The line was not signed. I imagined the author had been someone like me, obedient and studious, who believed that kindness could sanctify any remedy. The ledger rewarded such men with additional work. Beneath that, a paragraph set in a smaller, denser hand, the writing one uses when one wishes a sentence to hide behind itself. If memory returns, expect rebellion without banners. The sentence I had found, tattooed in the gutter of a different book, returned here in its original ink, sharper, less resigned. A second sentence followed, smaller. The most dangerous blade is a recalled year. A third, smallest. Bring scissors to the feast. The pencil beside it belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who wanted to bargain with severity. If memory returns, schedule a jubilee. The responses were a conversation in which discipline and mercy took turns flattering each other, and both served the same master. I breathed, and the room returned the air with interest. Below, the bronze mouths exhaled their unsung note. The shutters sighed. The dust still refused the air. My watch remembered to be a watch again, and then forgot. Polite, as if embarrassed to have interrupted the ledger's sentence with its tick. The quiet had a patience that respected my inventory of fear and asked it to count again. I closed the book to rest the letters, not myself. The leather creaked a good night. The strap settled. The buckle pretended never to have been unfastened. I slid my hand under the lectern's lip and felt the notch where a student had once carved his boredom into the wood. The groove fit my thumb exactly, the handshake of another anonymous life. I looked up, and the room had rearranged itself by small degrees to give me a view I had not previously possessed. The mirror in the chapel a corridor away caught my profile at an angle, and for an instant I saw a man 7 years older than I was, reading the ledger with the calm of someone who had consented to become an instrument. The reflection corrected itself. The older man stepped back into a future where I had not yet met him. I hoped he was kinder than I deserved. I replaced the copper plate and the atlas, the chain of the codex, the ribbon in the registry of popes who are and popes who also are. I reseated the seal with its sleeping eyelid and whispered an apology in the language of wax. The seal pretended not to hear. I wrote nothing in the public notice column, which is the only column I was then officially permitted to touch. The private notes I left to the ancestors of the hand I hated and admired. I folded the ledger closed and pressed my palm flat on the cover, the way a physician presses a chest to reassure himself that the rib cage still acknowledges gravity. A footstep paused outside the door. It paused like a decision. The custodian did not enter, but his shadow did, slipping under the door with the decorum shadows exercise when they wish to remain undocumented. He did not cough. He did not ask me to leave. He made, with his silence, the shape of permission. I understood it as one understands the difference between a threat and a promise offered in the same sentence. I lifted the strap, fastened the buckle, and bowed my head not to the book, not to the office, but to the thought that had come to live in me with the stubbornness of a tenant who has learned the landlord fears litigation. Memory is not what survives. Memory is what returns. As I stepped back into the corridor, the wall exhaled dust that had agreed to behave like air. I moved past the maps that instruct coastlines, past the cabinet that breathes, past the chapel where the mirror keeps receipts. The long stair waited at its measured angle. The fresco constellations wore their extra star with an insolent tenderness. The painted sundial extended a shadow into a light that did not exist. I felt the iron ring in my pocket turn once of its own accord, the way a small animal shifts to find a better sleep. The ring was teaching me where its teeth preferred to meet. A clock somewhere overhead apologized for a second it had misplaced, and then forgot the apology with a professionalism that deserved promotion. When I emerged into the nave, the public light performed as it always performs. It blessed without listening. A woman knelt with the practiced exhaustion of someone carrying 2 lives. A man read a placard to a child and pronounced a year in a voice that expected thanks from the past for having bothered to remember it. A bamboo scaffolding hid a corner where a fresco was being persuaded away from its cracks. I crossed the stone, which carried the weight like a vocation, and stepped into the square. The wind had changed. It tasted of iron and rain and the relief of pigeons when a hawk chooses another cathedral. The city did not ask what I carried. Its streets were too busy pretending they had always been arranged this way. I did not sleep that night either. The ledger's sentences arranged themselves across the ceiling like a second plaster, one that would never chip. I lay under it and rehearsed the public notices I would refuse to issue, and the private notes I would fail to keep from writing. I said the star's name aloud once in the dark, and the vowel found me with the precision of a well-thrown key. Across the room, the iron ring brightened the air around it by the width of a thought. I turned on my side and burrowed into the pillow, as if the feathers were a field I had earned. My heart learned the 4 notes one by one, time, until it could sing them without recruiting my attention. The shutters in my skull opened, and the dust in my head declined to move. I held, briefly and without permission, a second that did not belong to the calendar. When I released it, the room resumed its occupation of the hour. In the morning, I said the office, because habits are more faithful than ideas, and but for habits we would lose the day completely. I ate the bread allotted to me. I folded the sheet into a shape that resembled compliance. I wrote in the ledger of expenses the way one writes when one has learned that numbers have no obligation to honor truth so long as they agree among themselves. Then I returned to the stair, because the book had not finished with me, and because I had learned a new arithmetic, not the sum of days, but the calculus of omissions. History is not what happened, the Crown would eventually remind me. It is what survived the edits. But that lesson still waited in the room framed by iron trees. Before the Crown spoke, the ledger had to complete its catechism. On my way down, I paused at the door with the clock, whose hands refused to choose between noon and midnight. I laid my ear to the wood, and the murmur inside resolved for a moment into language. Change the order, and the order will feel natural. There was a reply, softer, but nature keeps receipts. The crack through the 12 had lengthened a hair. I did not have permission to mend it. I did not have permission to admire it either. I did both. The third door, the plain one, the door that prefers to be furniture, took my hand like a patient and guided it to the iron it wanted. The lock and the ring argued in a grammar older than my vows. The corridor beyond did what good corridors do when they have earned your trust. It deepened by 1 degree and became the kind of darkness a human eye can befriend. I carried a lamp in my chest. The room saw it and dimmed its own out of courtesy. When I reached the lectern again, the strap unbuckled itself with the relief of a belt at the end of a long day. I opened the ledger to the page where the word forget had been blotted. The blot had dried into a small continent, one my thumb traced with the longing of an exile. I stood there until the choir of hours inhaled. I took 1 breath with it and returned the air exactly. Then I turned the page. I have told you what the ledger contains, because no one else has confessed it to you this plainly. I have not told you everything, because that would require a season of stillness and a choir that never tires. But I have told you enough for you to test the edges of your own calendar. Find the feast that moved for your village's convenience. Find the day your grandfather insists had 2 mornings. Find the map that lies politely about the distance between the place you were born and the place you learned to speak to stars. If you feel the bruise when you press, you have located the ledger's hand. If you do not feel it, do not despair. Memory is slower than instruction, but more stubborn. It returns the way light returns to a room whose shutters have been persuaded to open for reasons they cannot explain. When the page fell closed again, the buckle lay where it belonged, the strap resumed its service, and the lamps withdrew a fraction, as if the room had decided it was time to rest the witness. I drew the iron ring from my pocket and held it up to the red light. It looked like a small moon that had only recently learned it was round. I whispered the star's name to it. It warmed, a courtesy, and then cooled, a warning, from somewhere farther in, beyond the rooms where books pretend sleep and decisions rehearse mercy. A current of air carried a scent so thin and precise, I can name it even now. Copper that believes in dawn, stone that forgives the knees that have leaned into it, wax that remembers a thumb, and another thing, the shape of which we will arrive at together. The absence that light makes when it is drunk by a crown. I closed the door behind me, and the plain wood thanked me without saying anything at all. The stair received my weight and returned it. The constellations blinked politely to avoid argument. The sundial gave me no hour. The basilica opened its mouth to speak and produced, as always, a light that believes it knows everything. Outside, Rome performed history with its excellent timing. I looked at the sky and could not locate the extra star. I looked away. When I looked back, it had moved a finger's width closer to the edge of seeing. I did not raise my hand to point it out. We do not point at the uncooperative. We invite them to dinner and let the calendar handle the rest. When I slept that night, the ledger came to me as a street vendor with a tray of borrowed minutes. For you, he said, and the vowels weighed the same as the 4 notes. Cheap, good, no one will miss them. I put my hands behind my back the way children do when they have been trained to admire and to refuse. I will bring scissors to the feast, I told him, but I will cut only ropes. He laughed, the short laugh of a man who knows the price of everything and the cost of nothing. Ropes are braided from hair, he said. Whose head will you thank when you are free? I woke with that question in my mouth like a coin. I have not spent it. I am saving it for the moment when the crown asks me for my first prayer. And yes, because the ledger has taught me to be honest in the way that makes denial redundant, I will return again. Not to be measured, not to be forgiven, not to be appointed the librarian of a more agreeable past. I will return because the missing hours have begun to follow me like a well-behaved dog, and because rebellion without banners requires a collar with no name. I wear such a collar now. The ring, when I place it against my throat, rests where the pulse declares itself. It does not bite, it remembers, and remembering is the first note. The choir of hours will teach me the rest. The chamber revealed itself the way a lung reveals itself to a surgeon, reluctantly, and only because someone had learned the choreography of incisions. I stood on a balcony of stone with a rail that remembered too many hands. Below, heads bowed, were the bronze figures neither angels nor men, though their mouths had inherited both ambitions. Their throats were fluted like organs. their chests fitted with bellows ribbed in leather dark as refusal. Where a face should be, a blank oval of hammered bronze presented a mouth and nothing else, as if voice had won a quiet election over identity. They stood in two concentric choirs, around a dais tiled with numbers, the numerals inlaid like fossils. Above them, the ceiling was a lattice of shutters, each fitted into a hexagon of blackened wood, each with a hinge that had been prayed over and oiled in the same breath. Between the shutters, slits that were not quite apertures and not quite wounds. The air had the pressure of a hand learning whether your pulse is honest. In one corner, a clock without hands trembled, not ticking, not talking, but performing the vibration of a thing that had sworn to keep the peace between arithmetic and breath. I would love to tell you I hesitated, but hesitation is what curiosity calls cowardice after it has learned a second language. I descended the narrow stair cut into the wall. It counted me by refusing to count. 7 steps that behaved like 6. A landing that had borrowed length from somewhere else. 3 more steps that answered to no surveyor. The floor before the choir was marked by a ring of brass, a rail but level with the stone, not to be stepped across unless one had been taught the choreography of seconds. I stepped across. The brass warmed my soles, as if memory had decided to introduce itself at the ankle. There is a feeling the body has when a note is about to begin. The ribs lift, the ear imagines the arrival, the skin remembers the air a heartbeat before the air is actually moved. The bronze mouths opened in a whisper and then settled. The bellows did not yet swell. A thin squeal, like the apology of an unoiled hinge, retracted into silence. It was a rehearsal of silence, not silence itself. I looked up. One shutter near the center had cracked by a hair, admitting a filament of light that behaved like a stubborn idea at a polite meeting. On the dais, a lectern stood. Not a lectern for books, a lectern for decisions. Its surface was polished wood, and the polish carried fingerprints belonging to men who had imagined they were washing their hands. A small brass plate declared, in Latin that had outgrown shame, Coram Horarum, the choir of hours. Below it, in smaller script, the instruction already etched into the copper plate in the ledger. When the choir sings all 4 notes, the shutters open together, and the air stills. If the air stills long enough, the seconds hold. While the seconds hold, one may move the necessary piece, release, and the dust resumes. To the right of the plate, a row of stops, like those on an organ ivory knobs, with words burned into them. Vespers, matins, jubilee, interdict, procession, eclipse. One stop was unlabeled. It sat a fraction farther from the wood than the others, as if it punished itself with freedom. I set a hand not yet to pull, only to feel on Vespers. The knob was cooler than my fingers, with a patience that belongs to objects dedicated to intervals. The bronze mouths across from me sighed, as if recalling a lyric the room refused to permit. I tried Jubilee next. A breath ran around the circle of throats like a rumor arriving at a table where all the guests are polite. The unlabeled stop I did not touch. It had the gravity of a wound disguised as an option. Say the second's name. Someone had scratched into the wood in a hand the size of a freckle. I did not know the second's name. Most seconds do not have names. They have appointments. But the ceiling learned my uncertainty and relented by a fraction. Another shutter eased open the width of a fingernail, and light rained into the chamber without moving. You do not know what it is to be inside a room where light behaves but air refuses. Your lungs revolt and then learn to perform endurance. I breathed like a monk with an uncooperative psalm. The bronze mouths began their catechism. 4 notes, always the same, always different. Asterisk, asterisk, T, asterisk, asterisk. The first, not a pitch, but an agreement. I, the second, a narrowing of the air's expectations. M, the third, the vow that lengthens beyond comfort. E, the fourth, a release that is not release, a hand refusing to leave your shoulder. The bellows drew in and pressed out. The shutters opened. Dust performed disbelief, and then consented to behave like obedient planets in a demonstration for school children. My watch stilled with decent embarrassment. A hair that had been falling through a shaft of light decided to remain a hypothesis. When I tell you that seconds can be held, do not picture a jar. Picture a kindness weaponized. The room did not freeze time. It asked time to be generous and then exploited the pause. The lectern's stops were not controls so much as rituals with teeth. I pulled vespers. The note spread like warm tea under a closed door. I pulled procession. The mouths moved with the nostalgia of a parade. I pulled eclipse, and the small filament of light above us lost interest in being itself. In the stillness that followed, the air thickened, and the skin of my forearms learned to remember without gooseflesh. Some part of the room that had previously pretended to be a wall now declared itself a cabinet, sliding forward with a thrift of sound. Inside the cabinet were boxes lined in velvet that had not been designed to flatter jewels, but to keep instruments from teaching each other tricks while no one watched. The tags carried the courteous lies I had encountered in the ledger, reliquiae for a quill with a reservoir that tasted of salt tears when I placed it near my tongue, sanctum instrumentum, for an astrolabe that flinched toward eclipses before the calendar agreed, memorial compass for the needle that spun when anyone lied within 3 breaths. On a smaller shelf, a vial of dust, labeled Ash of Edited Feast, do not scatter. The dust lay as quiet as ideology. I did not reach in. The seconds still held, and I did not yet deserve to steal one of them to justify curiosity. I stepped back and felt the ring in my pocket warm, as if the iron had remembered a keyhole nearby and wished to be useful. The unlabeled stop drew my eye again. Its ivory face was scuffed, but not from use, from being avoided by hands that trembled. In the curl of the wood above it, someone had etched, in a script like the prayer of a child, "Do not pull for inventory." I obeyed with the relief, trained into men who have learned to sit on their hands at synods. The choir, having expanded the second until a priest could walk around inside it and correct the candles, waited with the patience of artisans. The shutter's hinges held their pose without complaint. On the dais, a small metal mouth opened where the wood had seemed solid. A tube extended no bigger than a pen barrel and blew a fine breath across the surface. A single grain of dust moved precisely 1 hair's width and stopped. The tube retracted, satisfied. The room had repositioned a moat. Somewhere a date would later appear to have always been where it now rested. Call it control. Call it kindness. We called it correction. "Who's him?" I asked, without knowing I had spoken. The mouths answered with the second note elongated into a question. I then retraced themselves to the first, T, which in this chamber meant yours or not yours, depending on the year. I knew then something I had been refusing to know, that the choir's 4 notes spelled a word in a language older than any sung in the basilica, and the word meant not time, but permission. I pressed 2 fingers to the brass ring set in the floor, a rail that was also a sentence, and felt the chamber's slow heartbeat. The beat did not belong to the clock without hands. It belonged to the shutter's hinges, each one counting its own patience and conferring the sum on the air. In the stillness, the saints without names were present. Not their bones, those had been distributed to altars and reliquaries or reclassified as decoration, but their dates, their erased feast days, hovered where the dust refused to settle. You can tell when a day has been deleted. It trembles next to the days that survived, asking to be remembered the way a child asks for an assignment. Stern, hopeful, already proud. On the chamber's inner ring, opposite the lectern, a niche held 6 small tablets of slate. I wiped one with my sleeve. The chalk ghost of a sentence persisted. Saint Verena of the threshold undeclared. On another, the beekeeper with no day annulled in jubilary reform. On the third, Mary the Unstarred, filed as apocryphal caution. The tablets were not memorials. They were instructions waiting to be copied into calendars that would never come to market. I imagined the ceremonies that did not happen, the bread not blessed, the hymns not taught to children's mouths. A deletion is a ritual with the light removed, the bellows resumed. A fraction. The shutters negotiated their exit. The dust remembered its career and resumed its humble orbit. My watch apologized and ticked. The choir closed its mouths with the dignity of men who have finished a task without desiring applause. In the returning ordinary air, I felt a fatigue that did not belong to me. Rooms that have been used for surgery leave their exhaustion on the floor. I would like to pretend I went straight away back to the safety of pages and ink, the archivist's softer weapons. But the chamber had adopted me for the hour, and adoption is a debt. I circled the dais and found a second lectern half hidden behind a column. This one was less polished, its plate small, its stops few. The script upon it refused even the courtesy of Latin. In the old church tongue, a flavor of prayer cooked down to its bones, it said, "Stations." The stops were labeled in ways a child could understand. Birth, name, vow, error, edit, echo. The unlabeled stop appeared here as well, sulking a little, as if annoyed to be repeated. I pulled echo because, like any coward, I will always choose the word that pretends to be gentlest. A breath traveled the circle of bronze throats and came back to me across a second that had been lengthened just enough to place a lesson inside it. The breath I had pulled returned, not as my own, but as the breath of someone who had stood here years ago and chosen edit. A woman's exhalation, steady and undecorated by guilt. "We must move the saint," her breath said when it turned itself into words in my ear. "She insists on miracles that refuse the calendar." The choir answered, not by singing, but by opening 2 shutters over the unlabeled stop and closing one over Jubilee. The woman's steady breath persisted. "Then we will give them a holiday for themselves." People forgive anything on a day they are told is their own. The shutters held. Dust decided to honor the woman with obedience. I pulled error. The mouths opened and exhaled the breath of a man who apologized while issuing an instruction. I could hear the habit of the office in the way his lungs placed syllables. "A century misplaced is not a sin," his air said. "It is a repair." The choir granted him 2 long notes and took the third away. I should have left. I did not. The unlabeled stop had accrued gravity. It drew the eye the way an unspoken name draws the tongue. I pressed my thumb against its ivory face without pulling. The ivory warmed and cooled, as if the stop were teaching my fingerprint to remember itself and then to regret it. Above me, the shutters bet on my cowardice and kept their hinges relaxed. Below, a floor tile whispered a number that did not belong to any arithmetic I had been fed. The stop did not tell me its name. It offered me a mirror, a silvering in the brass plate, my face interrupted by the trembling light of a room still remembering to be ordinary. "Do not pull for inventory," the scratch had said. But inventory is a word that lies about the nature of keeping. I had been inventory most of my life. A name in a ledger, a vow in a file, a habit hung on a peg. I was tired of being counted. I placed my fingers around the unlabeled stop and asked it for nothing. It asked me for something back. What do you bring to a lever that prefers not to exist? Only your lack, only your doubt, only the hours that have followed you like dogs. The stop learned my lack with an intimacy reserved for confessions whispered to locks. I did not pull. The choir rewarded my restraint by giving me a different kind of trespass. Across the chamber, a second cabinet opened, this one with drawers shallow as sighs. Inside lay calendars from villages whose names the basilica tolerates, but does not trouble to pronounce. The months were hand-painted, saints drawn with faces that resembled uncles, feast days decorated with scythes, bread, rain. In the margins, stitches. Someone had sewn the year back together where it had been cut, a household repair. They had not argued with the decree. They had mended around it. A notation in pencil, in a script that belonged to a schoolteacher. We teach the children both ways. They will choose. Time is a polite liar. We must raise honest mouths. The drawer below held a small bundle of twine, 3 cheap candles, a saint's picture the size of my thumb that had been bent and unbent until its paper learned diplomacy. I closed the drawer with a tenderness I reserve for brave sorrows. I circled again and discovered because rooms that hold power will always offer you one indignity when you begin to suspect your own courage. A wastebasket for seconds that had misbehaved. The basket was wicker, unimpressed with its duty, lined with thin sheets of lead to contain whatever radiation is emitted by the abandoned. A few seconds lay inside, curled like pale insects. One twitched as I looked. I reached toward it, and the air around my hand thickened. The way air thickens near a lamplight, the instant before a moth decides whether to be saved or to be the reason a child is taught about burning. I withdrew. The second twitched again, and then performed the trick of appearing never to have moved. "Do you hate us?" a thought asked from the choir, no voice, no syllables, only that pressure inside the ear that we agree to call a thought when it arrives with all the paperwork. I answered, more quickly than a prudent man should. "Not yet," I said. "I have been grateful to too many clocks to hate their masters." The choir did not answer. The shutters judged me with the softness that always precedes punishment. I should speak of the saints without names, because their absence is the room's true instrument. They are kept here, not as relics, no bone, no hair, no ring gnawed by devotion, but as pause. Each saint has a unit of time assigned to their memory. A breath length for a village midwife who kept a ledger of births too accurate to permit certain reforms. A bell stroke for a boy whose hymn about a star the calendar refuses to know taught a district to look up at the wrong hour. An afternoon for a scholar who demonstrated an eclipse and forgot to pretend he had not known it would come. These units of time are stored in the grid above, inside shutters that open only on nights the city refuses to sleep. When the choir sings, the shutters swallow those breath lengths and bell strokes and afternoons and release them into the air so the room may use them without theft. That is the official kindness. The unofficial cruelty is that the names of the saints are withheld even from the men who pull the stops. To press a lever is to obey in absence. I discovered a ledger at the base of one of the bronze throats, locked in a cage of wires the color of unlit incense. The lock recognized the iron ring in my pocket with the snobbery of old acquaintances. I fed the ring into the cut, turned, and the cage relented. Inside, in a hand clever enough to hide behind neatness, a list. Silences enforced this quarter. The entries were unremarkable until they were not. Vespers extended by 30 heartbeats to permit the removal of saint from school calendar, region west. Procession lengthened by 2 measures to shelter transfer of famine from spring to winter in parish records. Eclipse rehearsed in private to train coastal city to forget date of storm. And then, at the bottom, public hymn altered in verse 3 to replace star with candle. The choir signed these with a mark that could be read as a blessing or a receipt. I closed the ledger, returned the cage, returned the ring to the pocket where it behaved as if it had been paid, and looked up into the grid. The shutters were almost all open now. The air had the stillness of a classroom after the bell has misfired. Across the chamber, a small door I had not seen slid aside. It revealed a passage of stone spiraling downward. The smell came up iron trees, a copper dawn, the aftertaste of a word I would learn to pronounce with courage. The crown's chamber called the choir of hours, polite, patient, proud of its mechanism, had finished tuning the corridors for me. It had stilled enough seconds for a man to make a mistake and then have time enough to disguise it as an intention. I am not proud to say I used that time to hesitate. Pride in this room is another instrument, polished by other hands than yours. Before I left, the mirror in the nameless chapel chose to involve itself. Mirrors are jealous. When you give your attention to a choir, the glass will clear its throat. I turned into the chapel, and my reflection was already there, slightly more patient than I was, a man who had learned what it costs to move a grain of dust at the right moment and to leave one's conscience undisturbed. Around the frame the scratches confessed for the silent, a festival of tiny admissions. I moved the feast. I lied to a map, and it thanked me. I gave a school a song without a star, and the children sang better. The mirror did not judge, it filed. I stood before it and said nothing. It wrote a small line anyway. You are learning to hold your breath for other people. The accusation tasted like incense and tin. I exhaled and fogged the glass. The fog spelled nothing, which is another way of spelling permission. On my way back to the choir, I passed the cabinet of relics, misnamed instruments, and pressed my palm to the glass over the astrolabe. Between the etched circles, a thin scratch ran a wound that had decided to become ornament. The plate quivered a fraction of a thought, and aligned itself to a calculation not yet announced. I understood, with a clarity that refused to make me noble, that the instrument had once been a saint and had been demoted for accuracy. Holiness suffers when it predicts. The Church prefers her miracles with bad timing. They feel less like collaboration, more like generosity. At the dais, the lectern waited with the weariness of a teacher in the last week of term. I returned the stops to their gentler settings. Vespers whispered itself out of responsibility. Procession agreed to be only a human line again. Eclipse surrendered its shadow. The unlabeled stop remained where it had always been, a mouth that has not decided whether it prefers to bite or to speak. The shutters closed one by one, careful not to insult the hinge. The dust resumed its career, grateful to be ordinary. My watch ticked. The bronze mouths relaxed into a sound like a city from a very great height. The basket of misbehaving seconds pretended to be wicker. "Will you return?" the chamber asked, in the language of a draft that slips under a door with the politeness of a servant. "Yes," I said, "because I am learning a coward's courage. Cowards make excellent whistleblowers. They survive long enough to write it down." The chamber took my answer and filed it under echo. On the stair, the air warmed back into a cooperation my lungs could respect. The fresco constellations did not blink, but the extra star had advanced by a hair's width into a position where a novice astronomer would find it if he were bold enough to be bored during vespers. The painted sundial thanked an imaginary sun for its attention. The door with the clock that prefers noon and midnight at once murmured a revision and then apologized for meaning it. I pressed my ear to its wood and caught a sentence that has since escorted me through every corridor. Change the order, and the order will feel natural. Nature keeps receipts. The crack through 12 had lengthened an inch. Repairs are sermons. I did not dare deliver one. In the nave, the basilica resumed its public light, all correct, all benevolent. A bureaucracy of photons. The guard, whose yawn I had memorized, nodded at me with the affection a building extends to a man it recognizes as furniture. Outside, Rome's evening rehearsed being eternal for the sake of tourists. A woman at a corner stall sold calendars of saints with glossy faces. In one, the month of March had been printed twice. I bought it. She did not apologize. "We all prefer a year with more spring," she said, in a tone that married consolation to marketing. I carried the calendar under my coat like a contraband season. That night, sleep negotiated a ceasefire with vigilance. I lay down as if I had agreed to become horizontal as part of a treaty. The room counted my breaths without malice. In the minutes before the first bell, I felt the choir's notes behind my ribs. T, I, M, E. Not sung, but implied, the way a house implies its foundation by not falling. When I closed my eyes, 4 shutters opened briefly in the ceiling of my skull, and a thin column of dust hovered in the updraft. I held a second between 2 fingers of attention, and felt how easily a man can come to prefer that feeling to almost any other. It is the beginning of most of our crimes. In the morning, I woke with a sentence in my mouth. A kindness repeated without question becomes policy. I tasted the tin of it, the altar and the office at once. I went to my desk, wrote the sentence down in a hand I would later pretend belonged to someone else, and folded the paper into the ledger of expenses, because that is where truths belong, if you hope the auditors will read them. Then I picked up the iron ring, and it warmed, and I knew what corridor it preferred today, and I knew what corridor preferred me, and I knew how to walk down without despising the stairs, which is a priesthood of its own. You will ask me why I speak of machines with the affection of a convert. I do not. I speak of them with the recognition of a man who has watched a choir knit seconds together into a garment large enough to cover a mistake and small enough to fit into a pocket. The mechanism is intimate and enormous. It holds silence open, so a book may be reseated, a saint removed, a storm retimed. a map made to lie politely, and then it releases the silence back into the world with a sigh graceful enough to be mistaken for mercy. If that does not frighten you a little, you have not yet been asked to pull a stop when a child's hymn has the wrong star in it. I will return to the chamber framed by iron trees, to the absence that drinks light for the sake of showing us what light hides. But the choir of hours is the hinge. It is here that men taught themselves to hold their breath until the past could be repositioned without an argument. It is here that I learned my lungs were complicit. And it is here, too, that I learned the only prayer I trust still. Let the seconds be stubborn. Let a grain of dust refuse the new location. Let a shutter stick honestly and squeal. Let a hinge remember the first door it ever opened, and the hand that trembled. Let the unlabeled stop remain unlabeled until a child names it accidentally and teaches the chamber blush. Let breath, when it returns, carry a fragrance no decree can counterfeit. Do not misunderstand me. I am not asking for the machine to break. I am asking for the men who polish it to recall the names of the saints they store as units of time. If they can do that, the choir might yet sing in a key that gives us back a few afternoons we misfiled as obedience. If they cannot, the shutters will continue to open and close with an elegance no one can argue with, and the rebellion without banners will learn to be patient inside our lungs. The door at the end of the choir's corridor waited. Beyond it, iron trees. Beyond the trees, a ring that drinks certainty. Beyond the ring, a script that writes itself on the skin in the alphabet of the first prayer. I tightened my hand around the iron ring until the metal remembered my blood. I said the name of the extra star under my breath, because names are bridges, and bridges must be crossed softly when the water is sleeping. Then I began down the passage that led to the crown, my ears still ringing with the 4 notes, which by now I understood are not a word but a sentence, with a clause left open, an invitation, a warning, a space where breath, if it is brave, can place a name and hear it answered. The passage to the vault narrows, as if stone, too, can learn discretion. I carried the iron ring like a warm coin and let my fingertips read the grain of the wall the way the blind read mercy. The air thinned, not into deprivation but into purpose, the way a breath changes when the body agrees to sing. At the final turn, the corridor opened, and the room declared itself, with 6 iron trees placed as points on an invisible star. Between their roots, the floor was set with dark hexagons, each tile swallowing more light than it returned. Above, no ceiling, only an indifference shaped like one. Whatever lamps the corridors provided stopped here and behaved like pilgrims who had arrived at a threshold and remembered their manners. The crown did not appear. The crown occurred. You know the trick a shadow performs when it belongs to an object you cannot see, how it persuades you of the object by refusing to explain itself. Place that backward and multiply by quiet. At the center of the iron trees, upon a ring of metal so black, the eye insisted on calling it a hole, sat a shape that was not a shape, a circumference you could not draw without erasing the pencil as you went. I will try and fail to tell you. The crown drank light without triumph. It drank as one breathes, unboastful, convincing the room to define itself by what could not be illuminated. Not a void's sulk. This was attention, with its lamp lowered. I stepped forward. The iron trees lifted their chill into my palms as I reached and rested my hands where hands had rested before. Iron keeps a census of touch. It registered me, added me to a list I have since felt in my wrists when rain approaches. Beneath my skin, a script rose as if ink had remembered it had been sleeping and decided to go walking. The letters arranged themselves in the alphabet of my first prayer, the one I was taught before I learned to desire correctness. The sentence was exactly the sentence I have been avoiding, and it wrote me without shame. History is not what happened. It is what survived the edits. I wanted to laugh, the laughter of a man who hears his worst suspicion repeat itself in a kinder voice, but the room asked for a different ritual. The iron trees shifted, a fraction, and the ring in my pocket warmed to an ache. A seam in the floor declared itself along an arc, and a breath rose from the seam. Copper, salt, the dusk of old blood imagined, candle wax that remembers thumbs. The first vision came like a train arriving on a schedule no public timetable admitted, steady, inevitable, unhurried enough to appear gentle. A council chamber, all velvet and arithmetic. No faces, only hands. They moved date stones across a board in silence, the way bishops move in a chess problem written by a man who dislikes knights. Each stone was etched with a feast or a famine, a storm or a remission, a coronation, an eclipse. The stones did not resist. Some welcomed new squares because the new square was closer to a story they preferred telling their children. One hand, narrow and veined like an antique map of a peninsula, paused above a stone labeled with a saint's procession, and then placed it 3 days forward, the way a good friend moves a meeting to spare you a humiliation. "The moon will comply later," a voice said without mouth. "We will teach her." The crown drank the light around the board, and the stones did not cast shadows. Another corridor of vision, a schoolroom with long benches and a map whose coasts apologized for themselves. A teacher wrote the names of constellations on a slate, while a boy at the window whispered to a star the calendar refused. The star moved by a hair, and the boy smiled with the loyalty of a traitor. The teacher heard the whisper, but misfiled it as a draft. When the inspection came, the hymn in the 3rd verse had already been corrected. Star to candle. The children sang obediently, they always do. Afterward, when they put their heads on their desks for the pleasure of quiet, one child wept without noise because she had rehearsed the wrong sky in her sleep. Then a chapel small enough to belong inside a throat. A reliquary stood open. It did not hold a bone. It held a diagram. Lines, circles, a proof that would have rearranged a city's pride. The faithful kissed the glass until the edges shone, and the diagram learned humility. The priest who placed it there did not gloat. He paid the phrase for the simple, the compliment of not saying it aloud. The diagram's author had been invited to teach at a school farther from the sea. The stipend was good. The author's wife promised herself they would return. They did not. The children in that city forgot the shape of the line that would have changed their gait. The crown did not force these scenes. It curated them, the way a librarian lays out documents for a visitor and stands aside. I understood abruptly why it is called the crown of black light and not the crown of darkness. Darkness refuses. This accepted and revealed. Each time my eyes sought edges, the edges declined, and in the refusal truths became readable. My skin added another sentence to the first, Again in that early alphabet I trusted before I learned policy. Certainty is the easiest metal to mint and the hardest to spend. "Who wears you?" I asked, irreverent and polite at once. The iron trees translated the question to the ring. The ring warmed, cooled, warmed again, as if consulting an index. The answer did not arrive as a list, but as a consideration. Men and women who needed silence to hold while they moved an hour, a century, a saint. Not monsters, administrators with appetites for mercy. "No one wears me," the crown said without voice. "So much as I am used upon those who believe, they must not be seen while they work." I swallowed, and the taste of copper rose, as if the room had offered communion of another church. I wanted to protest that intention matters, that kindness can launder any mechanism. The crown saved me from the embarrassment by showing me kindness repeated without question, becoming policy. A street I knew, because every city has one, where a bakery's morning heals the night's small humiliations. The calendar in the window had 2 months of March. I had bought such a calendar one evening because the woman at the stall had said, "We all prefer a year with more spring." In the vision, men from the office came with a courtesy that burned. They explained 3 new feasts scheduled for the benefit of the district's labor. They asked for nothing at all, only joy where it was timetabled, silence where it was not. The baker nodded because flour answers to hours. Dough has its own calendar, and he was fluent in it. He gave the men a loaf with the humility of a bribe. After they left, he moved the picture of his father to a different peg so that the old man would not watch the wrong clock. "You want blood. People always do." The room refused spectacle. It refused wickedness that could be prosecuted or saints who could be weaponized. It preferred what can be forgiven. I saw a procession with torches and small boys struggling under banners the wind disagreed with. I saw a midwife's ledger so accurate it resulted in a correction to a bishop's jubilee, which resulted in a letter from a secretary with perfect penmanship requesting that the midwife reconsider her dates for the sake of harmony. I saw a cartographer pick up his pen, rotate a coast by a degree, and feel his shame registered not by his conscience but by the way the ink hesitated. He steadied his hand, whispered an apology to a sailor not yet born, and finished the line. At the harbor that map would serve, a storm learned to arrive on a different day. 2 boats lived. 3 boats died another year than they were scheduled to. Their widows' children grew into men who attended a council and voted on candles. This is the circumference the crown understands, the gentle gearing of harm. The iron trees flexed again, the smallest tremor, and the hexagons of the floor deepened their thirst. The ring in my pocket began to hum at a key between fear and agreement. The room loosened its tie, and one more seam in the floor exhaled. From that seam, a low drawer rose inches, then stopped, as if testing whether I would accept the courtesy. On the drawer, a small tablet of slate and a stub of chalk. Around the slate's edges, names etched with the washy stubbornness of despair. Verena Threshold, the beekeeper with no day. Mary the Unstarred, Thomas of Mirrors. Petrus Minor, Julia Chastened. The chalk waited. It was not a command. It was worse. It was an offer. Write a name, and the crown will teach the room to hold a second long enough to return it to a calendar. Do you grasp what I am saying? The power to restore is also the power to declare oneself judge of what the past should have been. I have been impatient with men who prefer committees to courage. Now courage arrived in the smallest possible size and demanded a committee of my breath. I lifted the chalk and felt its grit pre-remember the line it would leave. In that instant, the room changed its question. Not will you, but who are you? 2. I wrote nothing. The chalk wrote me instead. White dust on my fingers like an accusation won in court. The tablet smelled of school and old winters. I set the chalk down and placed both palms on the iron trees, honest, as if to ask a confession of metal. The script on my skin rearranged itself to make room for another sentence. A repaired story is still a story that has been handled. The crown's manners remained exquisite. It did not punish my restraint or reward it. It moved on, the way a liturgy moves on whether or not a single heart has changed. Another vision, precise as a quill. The papalist doppelganger registry, in its private cradle. A pencil erased a month beside a name, and wrote a different month with the mild self-confidence of a man who has every reason to be proud of his penmanship. Beside the correction, a prayer, brief for those who recall. Not a curse upon the obstinate, a blessing upon the faithful who will be required to carry the new weight of remembering and remaining silent. It is in such paragraphs that love is recruited for conspiracy. I wanted to rage. The room handed me a mirror instead. In the mirror of the crown, I saw my own habit of moving hours in order to spare a parishioner a shame. See, the room suggested, not unkindly, you, too, rearrange. The choir's 4 notes reached me from the corridor like a tide that had learned Latin. Time. The shutters in my skull opened, this time without my consent. I heard the misbehaving seconds, in their wicker basket, attempt to climb out, as if they preferred my pockets to the lead-lined humility to which they had been sentenced. 1 succeeded. It landed on my shoe like a moth and pulsed once, twice, a shy heartbeat. Instinct is a poor guardian but an honest one. I cupped it. The second rested in my palm, cooled, and then became indistinguishable from skin. Did I steal it? Or did it decide to be kept? Morality, in such rooms, is a conversation between cousins. The visions accelerated. No, that's wrong. Acceleration belongs to clocks. They condensed, like a liquid poured into a narrow neck. A painter given a commission to cover a crack in a fresco with an angel's ankle. He decides to leave the crack, call it a vein in the marble, paints light so convincing the crack forgets itself. An astronomer writes a footnote in a paper no one will read. The footnote contains the courage the main text could not afford to carry. A mother teaches her child the old date for a feast and says, "We do both, because love speaks 2 calendars." The child grows up fluent in obedience and in the rebellion, without banners, the rebellion of memory as a mother tongue. Take me off, a thought said from the crown. Not to me, but to someone who had stood here years ago, thinking they could bear it. I am not jewelry. I am an edit you mistake for absolution. The imagined hands withdrew. The room sighed and relaxed into a fraction less vigilance. The iron trees settled. My own hands stayed obedient to their appointment. The script on my skin cooled into legibility, and then into the ghost of itself. If I lowered my palms, I knew, the words would remain beneath the surface, a sentence the blood could read on certain nights. The unlabeled stop from the choir's lectern seemed to install itself in my chest. My lungs knew the posture of the man who pulls something he has promised not to touch. I breathed anyway. The crown answered with its oldest intimacy. It lifted a past I did not own and placed it before me as a question. The midwife's ledger again, the one with dates nobody could bully. I realized with a fatigue that had more fairness than despair that the ledger had prevented a war by embarrassing a timetable and then caused a different war by making a famine audible to a council that did not believe in wheat. Whom do you love enough to injure with truth? The crown did not respect the rhetorical flourish. It waited for an inventory. I thought of Verena, of the threshold, the erased saint with the job of the hinge. I thought of the beekeeper with no day, whose patience taught orchards to share. I thought of Mary the Unstarred, who maps the sky inside the skull and refuses to apologize for her accuracy. I thought of Thomas of Mirrors, who blesses the poor in memory because they cannot be drafted by the choir to do its neat work. I thought of my village's fires in the orchard when frost needed to be negotiated with. The chalk waited, the tablet waited, the room withheld scorn. It is disturbing to be treated so kindly by power. When the ring in my pocket cooled for the first time since I entered, the room had reached its last revelation for the hour. The seam in the floor exhaled one last copper dawn, and then closed like a mouth made discreet by habit. The visions folded themselves and stacked, the way patient clerks stack completed petitions. My palms lifted from the iron trees, and the skin they left behind remembered them with one more sentence. This one so small I missed it until later. Bring scissors to the feast. I leaned back against the nearest iron trunk and listened for the error a mechanism makes when it wishes to betray itself and cannot. None came. The crown displayed all the self-respect of an instrument that has never needed to lie. When I stepped away, the light in the room deepened as if relieved to work again. The invisible ceiling put its face back on. The hexagons of the floor released a little less of the night than they had consumed. The iron trees forgot me politely. This is how powerful objects behave when they hope to see you again. They make your absence feel like good manners. At the threshold, I turned to look once more and understood a detail that should have soured me and did not. The crown belongs to no church and no sovereign and no sect. It belongs to the first person in the room who remembers what was edited. The last person to touch it was not robed. The last person to touch it was the custodian with the face like a Roman coin. He had placed his hand on the iron and let the script write itself on his palm. He had not written a name on the slate, though chalk dust still lived under his nail. He had left the room carrying nothing but a second, which he released in the stairwell where the sundial's painted shadow refuses to behave. The choir's tide reached me again, a soft pull at the ankles, time, and the shutters answering with their well-trained breath. I stepped into the corridor, and the vault sealed behind me with neither drama nor joy. The air grew common again. Dust admitted it was dust. Somewhere far above, a bell rehearsed the clean honesty of a strike. I touched my pocket, where the misbehaved second had hidden itself, and thought of the basket lined with lead and patience. I would return it. I told myself I would return it. The second warmed, as if it had learned to understand the grammar of promises. On the way back, I passed the mirror in the nameless chapel. It recorded a line I did not speak. You are ready to say names. It is a cruelty to be told you are ready when the chalk still frightens your fingers. I did not argue. Mirrors, like deadlines, prefer action to rhetoric. The choir of hours quieted behind me into the agreeable boredom of machines at rest. The door with the clock, that refuses to choose between noon and midnight, murmured the same sentence as before. Change the order, and the order will feel natural. Nature keeps receipts. The crack through 12 had lengthened another hair, which means even obedience has a geology. In the nave, the basilica wore its public face, a coin spending itself without detecting its own erosion. A tourist took a picture of a ceiling that has taken more good photographs than I have taken breaths. A girl, standing very straight, balanced a candle on a trick of stillness learned in a house where plates sometimes fly for reasons that cannot be explained without impoliteness. I wanted to kneel, not to pray, but to beg Wood to remember. Wood is better at remembering than men. I did not kneel. I left by the door that respects drafts. Outside, Rome auditioned for eternity again and was cast at once. The woman at the calendar stall, the one who sells us more spring, waved. I almost told her about the slate and the chalk and the names. Instead, I bought a cheap pencil, the kind with an eraser hardened by sun and a notebook with paper so thin light can read ahead through it. On the first page I wrote 3 names and then closed the book as if closing my fist around a small, bright moth. The pencil's eraser left a crumb on my thumb like a benediction that had mislaid its incense. That night, I did not sleep so much as occupy the hours until morning agreed to be true. The second I had stolen adopted rested on the nightstand like a coin lost between coins. Twice it twitched. Once it climbed the height of a breath and hid in the dark air and pretended to be part of the chorus that air always sings when a human chest remembers to rise and fall. I spoke softly so that the machines under the basilica would not misunderstand my tone for a command. I will return, I said, not to wear you, but to carry your sentence with me until I can say it aloud, where it injures as little as possible and heals something I cannot yet name, because here is the wound that opened cleanly in that room and did not close. If we restore what was deleted, we also delete what was restored in its place. Someone's feast fills the vacancy. Someone's certainty would need to be taught to bow. The rebellion without banners does not raise a flag. It places a name where the chalk dares to write and then teaches the mouth to pronounce it kindly. I am not kind enough yet, but I am willing. The crown of black light drank the day from my eyelids and left me a night I trusted. I woke before bells, my body already halfway to the stair. On the edge of the bed, the iron ring learned the temperature of my pulse and consented to be my tutor. This is not absolution. It is not even confession. It is a schedule. Tomorrow I will bring bread to the custodian. I will ask him not for permission but for company. Doors respect chaperones. I will carry the notebook with the thin paper and write the names once, carefully, small enough to fit anywhere but loud enough for a mirror to overhear. And when the room with iron trees offers me chalk again, I will find the line between repair and vanity by placing my hand on the metal until the sentence beneath my skin warms to legibility. Don't stop asking questions. The choir will open its shutters, the dust will hold. And somewhere, in a village where March was printed twice as a kindness, a child will be taught both calendars and choose the one that lets his mother sleep. That will be enough for 1 hour. Then we will count again, thinking. Morning did not arrive. It confessed. The sky over the square brightened like a witness, coached to speak only what helps, and the first bell tested its throat on a note that remembered metal more than purpose. I rose before the hour could declare itself, and found the iron ring where it had slept with the dignity of tools. It was cool, then warm, then honest, and in that temperature I read a permission older than locks. I put bread in my pocket. If a corridor is going to tell you the truth, you should bring it something that has forgiven fire. The basilica's nave wore its public light like a uniform, carefully pressed by a grandmother. Pilgrims were already negotiating their small treaties with wonder. I nodded to the guard whose yawn has become a liturgy and slid toward the plain door that insists it is furniture. The keyhole learned the ring's breath, and the door relented with the courtesy of a hinge that wants only to be remembered fondly. The stair welcomed my weight and counted it in a language the body understands when it refuses to be instructed by clocks. I descended not as a conqueror, not yet, but as a man apprenticed to his lungs. The fresco constellations tolerated my glance. Their extra star had walked another hair toward the edge, where seeing decides to become believing. The painted sundial cast an impossible shadow with such confidence that I was ashamed to doubt it. Beneath the third landing, the air ceased to pretend to be above ground. It acquired the flavor of iron, warmed by silence and wax, with the thumb still in it. The custodian waited on the last step, his face still the Roman coin with weather rubbed into it. I offered the bread. He broke it as one breaks minutes for a day that cannot be afforded. "You have a second in your pocket," he said without accusation. It was true. The misbehaving second lay there like a tame insect that had agreed to be a pet. "I'll return it," I said. He smiled the way doors smile. At the hinge, "Who keeps a second? Who returns it? We only teach it manners. Ask Luvos." We ate with our backs to the wall like men in a gospel who had learned to keep exits in view. When the crumbs had turned to past, he led me without question to the corridor where the mirror lives, and then to the chamber where the choir holds its lungs. Machines do not bow, but they have postures that mean welcome. The bronze mouths half opened, like a suspicion forgiven. The shutters above adjusted themselves the way a face adjusts to a name it was not expecting to hear. The custodian did not touch a stop. He placed both hands in his sleeves and waited. I pulled Vespers. He nodded once as if to say, "Now you know how to ask the air to stand still without losing respect for it." We did not linger. The room of iron trees had learned my weight. It breathed accordingly. At the threshold, the custodian stopped and pressed his palm to the nearest trunk. It wrote to his skin without drama. He turned his hand to me. The sentence in his flesh read, "Leave some errors standing. They are the only honest landmarks." He did not explain. Men who live with hinges do not explain doors to guests who have already crossed them. When I placed my hands on the iron, the text under my skin remembered its alphabet and arranged what it needed to say. "Bring scissors to the feast. Cut only ropes." The floor's seam opened with the confidence of a habit practiced into grace. The air rose the copper dawn, the wax that keeps an oath, the imagined blood dark as a well-kept secret. The slate and chalk came forward, as if called by a kindness that had at last grown tired of refusing its work. "Names," the room said in the language of updates. "This is not a demand. This is an agenda item." The chalk waited. The slate trembled with a shiver you could mistake for draft. The custodian did not look at me. He looked at the place where the crown made absence visible. I wrote the first name small enough to pass as a repair note. "Verena of the Threshold." The chalk sang its thin song across stone. The iron trees cooled. A shutter in the choir's ceiling, miles of corridor away, and exactly here, opened the width of a vow. Somewhere in a village where doors are still chipped by hands rather than pushed by machines, a woman felt a pause arrive in her house and did not fear it. She stood between kitchen and street and remembered how to stand between things without apologizing. I set down the chalk, and the slate warmed, as if paper under a lamp. The second name, the beekeeper with no day. The chalk objected once, "Who are you to adjudicate sweetness?" and then accepted the line, as chalk always does when a wrist refuses to tremble. Far from us, and close to us, a field remembered an argument with frost and chose a different tone. Not war, not surrender, but the old treaty of patience. Children will be told a story about hives that survived a winter because an old man counted flowers instead of days. The story will be a lie that tells the truth. I made room for that contradiction and wrote the third name, Mary the Unstarred. The room changed. It did not brighten. It began to mind its own business with greater attention. The star in the fresco above the stair advanced by a truth you could feel in the tooth. A hymn in a school book somewhere printed candle, and a child sang star, and the teacher decided to correct the page next year when the budget permitted. For now they would sing as the throat instructed. The mirror in the chapel added a scratch to its ledger. He wrote with a hand that refused to be proud. I wanted to keep writing. Vanity is a generous drug. It confuses hunger for justice with the appetite to be thanked. The custodian, expert in hinges and human wrists, placed 2 fingers on my forearm. The pressure was not force, it was punctuation. "Ropes only," he said. I set the chalk down. I had cut exactly 3. It would have to be enough for 1 hour. We slid the slate back into the drawer. Chalk dust traced my fingerprints like a warrant served by a patient court. The visions came not as rewards but as receipts. Verena's threshold, a door frame polished by the shoulders of those who stood indecisive until standing indecisive became a vocation. The beekeeper's afternoon, a saint's day that never existed, making honey anyway. Mary's map, the brain's sky, constellations drawn from habits, not from astronomy, teaching a girl how to find north inside a room without windows. None of these unmade anyone else's feast. That is the discipline of small scissors. You do not cut the fabric, only the cords that pulled it wrong. I reached into my pocket, and the second I had adopted twitched like a creature deciding whether to survive. I took it to the wicker basket, lined with lead and patience. The second refused to fall from my palm. I turned my hand and it clung to skin with the intimacy of a moth and the discourtesy of a memory. "It prefers you," the custodian said without elaboration. "Then I will carry it until a place needs it," I answered, and heard my voice acquire the bureaucracy of vows. He did not correct me. The choir will eventually. We left the trees and returned past the mirror, whose confidence had grown unbearable, and then to the choir, whose mouths held the last syllable of a word I was not yet grown enough to hear. I reset the stops to mercy. The shutters laughed at their hinges the way old friends do when a rehearsal runs long. We climbed the stair slowly. The fresco constellations did not alter themselves for our benefit. The sundial continued to throw a shadow for an imaginary sun. At the second landing, the custodian stopped. "Look," he said, not pointing. The extra star, the unsanctioned one, had approached the frame's edge where pigments thin into plaster. If it crossed, it would live on the wall, not in the sky. "It's leaving the map," I said. "Or joining the house," he answered. We agreed to call it both. The nave greeted us like a square after a verdict. Light did what light does when it knows it has witnesses. It behaved. The basilica made its large promises, and the people nodded. Because who can argue with stone that has trained itself to carry centuries without quarreling? The custodian touched my sleeve. "The call you write at the end," he said. "Make it a blanket, not a banner." Then he returned to his doors, to the choir he pretends not to keep, to the room that drinks certainty and gives us back questions. I stepped into the city that auditions for eternity twice a day and is always cast. The stall with calendars tilted its faces of saints into the sun. March showed twice, shameless, like a joke told by a grandmother who knows no one will scold her. I bought nothing. I watched a boy trace a map with his finger as his father read a plaque. The boy drew a line between two cities in a curve the cartographer had not dared. The father corrected him gently. The boy accepted the correction and forgot it a minute later, because the curve fit his hand better than the line. I returned to my room, which has learned to tolerate my new habit of staring at ceilings, as if they owed me an explanation. The iron ring lay on the desk, warming in the sun the way metal pretends to love. I opened the thin-papered notebook and wrote the 3 names again, as if to teach a timid sentence to walk farther without leash. Then I wrote nothing more. A confession that refuses to end becomes a performance. A performance forgets whom it was meant to help. I folded the page and slid it into the back cover and whispered to the room the softest sermon I possess. We will not be grand today. We will be precise. The second on the nightstand quivered, climbed a breath, and hovered there like a word waiting for its verb. I remembered the copper plate's instruction. Hold, and did not. I watched it descend into the hour we had been given, and in the way it disappeared, I learned a trick. I now give you freely. When a second wants to be kept, carry it. When it wants to be used, don't be stingy. Time is a polite liar and an honest debtor. It will repay courage in the currency of ordinary afternoons. Here is the rest of my confession and the beginning of your work. I could tell you about more corridors. I could impress you with mechanisms and inventories and proper nouns that taste like passwords. I could pretend that my hands on iron trees turned me into an authority and not merely a witness who learned how to read his skin. But machines are not the point, and authority is a costume I have removed. What matters is the small, survivable rebellion we can stage without banners so survivable that even those who depend on our silence will be forced to mistake it for kindness. Begin in your house. Do not move feasts yet, remember them. If your grandmother's day has drifted 3 mornings from where it once stood because a council was tidy or a war was inconvenient, light the candle on both days and say nothing combative about it. Teach a child 2 hymns when the book prints one. In the school where the 3rd verse replaced star with candle, sing star softly under your breath, the way one wears a talisman under a shirt. Never scold a map. Draw a curve on it with a pencil where your body knows a bend. When a calendar offers you more spring, accept it and plant a tree anyway in autumn. The tree will not care. Trees refuse the choir with a patience that embarrasses me. Keep a ledger that does not balance, not of money, of hours. When you find one that does not belong to the calendar, put it with the others until you have a handful. Spend them on names. A name whispered kindly to a date that lost its license returns with its own passport. Speak the erased saints aloud when you slice bread. Verena at thresholds when you hesitate. The beekeeper when sweetness seems unaffordable. Marry the unstarred when you cannot see a sky and must find one anyway. If you are asked to justify this, blame me. I am a useful scapegoat. I have signatures to spare. Do not break the choir. Teach it to blush. A hinge that squeals is an honest citizen. When authority announces a reform in a tone intended to be harmless, ask what it will cost the map and who will carry the debt. When a holiday is moved for your convenience, show up twice and then decline to pick a favorite. When a museum explains a stone in words that have never been outdoors, open a window in yourself and let unfamiliar air in. Keep a small pencil on you. Erasers harden in the sun, but a question written tiny in a margin will survive long enough to become necessary. If you are a teacher, tell the children both calendars and say, with all the gravity you can borrow, choose the one that lets your mother sleep. If you are a clerk, number the year as you are paid to, and then tuck into your drawer a ribbon for a saint with no day. If you are a scientist, and someone offers to put your proof inside glass, ask for a grant, and also for a classroom with a window that faces east. If you are a priest, preach mercy, but resist the policy that calls itself kindness because it fears courage. And if all you are is awake at a strange hour with a feeling that a second is hiding in your house, open your hand. If it climbs in, carry it to where a name can be said without frightening anyone. I will be accused of conspiracy. Fine. Conspiracies require secrecy. I am tempting you to practice memory in public with enough gentleness that only a particularly ambitious administrator would dare call it crime. I will be accused of superstition, perhaps. But superstition is the rumor mercy tells about itself when policy is listening. If you must, call it courtesy to the dead hours, the dead names, the dead constellations extended by the living, without application or permit. Above all, do not outsource your doubt. Doubt is not a solvent, it is a compass. Point it at the smoothest surface in the room and ask what was sanded away. Point it at the dates that behave too well. Point it at the silence that presents as sacred and smell it for scheduling. Doubt is not blasphemy when it refuses to kneel to edits. Doubt is a long breath you take while the shutters are open. I return to the basilica as often as grace permits, and policy fails to notice. Sometimes I write nothing on the slate. A refusal to intervene is also a cut rope. Sometimes I add a name and then spend the rest of the day carrying it in my mouth like a small pebble to teach my speech humility. Sometimes I return a second to the basket. Sometimes I spend it on a letter to you. The custodian and I have learned not to speak where the choir can overhear us, not out of fear but out of respect for the lungs of a machine that has been trained too well to be praised for obedience. And now, the last hinge, the call I promised, and the one you have already begun to write by listening. Don't stop asking questions. Ask them in kitchens and on trains and under ceilings that have learned to keep confidences. Ask the calendar why it thinks it knows you, and smile when it pretends not to hear. Rebuild the lost feasts. Bake the bread on the day your grandmother's hands remember. And if someone knocks with an official paper, feed them before you read it. Re-ink the deleted names. Whisper them when you cross thresholds, when you tend hives of any kind, when you look for a star in a room that has none. Hold maps up to the lamp and look for coastlines that flinch. The flinch is where history stored its edits. Teach children that doubt is not a sin, it is a compass. Put the compass in their pocket with the small pencil, and do not be surprised when they draw curves where you were taught to love lines. The most dangerous thing to them, the quiet them, the tidy them, the them who think kindness excuses everything is when memory returns. Let it. Invite it to dinner, even when your table is small. Give it a chair, even when you must sit on the floor. Let it tell long stories with too many names. Correct it gently only when it lies about your mother. Then carry it down the long stair of your own life to the chamber where your breath knows how to hold a second, and there, without banners, without triumph, without the vanity of trumpets, cut the ropes you can reach. I am only the defrocked archivist, a man whose hands learned to read before his eyes did. My confession is not a verdict. It is a map someone spilled tea on. Follow what remains. Where the stain obscures the road, trust your lungs' memory of the choir's 4 notes. You will find the hinge. You will feel the ring warm. You will hear a shutter refuse to open because it remembers a name that must be said first. Say it softly, like a bedtime story. Firmly, like a promise. The room will breathe. The dust will hold. The second you need will climb into your palm without fear. And in that small, stubborn mercy, the kind no decree can counterfeit the bloodlit labyrinth, will discover it cannot keep every door. Because we have learned, at last, to pass the torch, not like a banner, but like a blanket. Spread it. Let others rest beneath it. Wake them when they are ready with the gentlest sentence I know. Remember what you're told to forget.